close your eyes, or leave them open, resting softly on the darkness of your ceiling or the familiar contours of your room. Either way, let the weight of the day begin to lift from you now. Let your shoulders settle a little deeper into whatever is holding you. Let your breathing slow, just slightly, just naturally, not forced, not controlled, just allowed to find its own quiet rhythm. Tonight, we're going to travel, not far in miles, but immeasurably far in time. We're going back, centuries back, millennia back, to a world that once existed in the same places you know, in the same valleys, on the same hills, beneath the same stars that are above you right now, even if you cannot see them. We're going back to listen to the sound of children falling asleep. It is a strange and tender thing to think about. Somewhere in ancient Rome, in a narrow house with thick stone walls and the smell of olive oil and warm bread drifting through every room, a small child is being settled into sleep by a woman humming something low and rhythmic. In a Viking longhouse somewhere in what will one day be Norway, a boy of 7 curls into the warmth of his sheepskin, listening to the fire crack and settle, his eyes growing heavy while his father sharpens a blade in the corner. In Egypt, 4,000 years ago, a child lies on a reed mat in a whitewashed room, and outside the window the warm desert air moves slowly, and the Nile breathes its ancient breath somewhere nearby. Children have always fallen asleep. They have always been tired at the end of their days. They have always sought warmth and quiet and the comfort of a familiar voice. In this, across all the centuries, they were exactly like you. But the days that wore them out, those days were something else entirely. Tonight, we're going to explore what childhood actually looked like across human history. Not the sanitized version from storybooks, not the romantic version from paintings of rosy-cheeked children in meadows, but the real version, quiet and sometimes startling, of what it meant to be young in a world that was harder, colder, sharper, and in many ways more demanding than anything most of us will ever know. This is not a frightening journey. We will move through it gently, the way you might turn the pages of a very old book by candlelight, letting each image appear and settle before moving to the next. The past does not threaten us here. It simply asks us to bear witness, to understand, and in understanding to feel a kind of deep and quiet gratitude for the softer world we inhabit now. Because childhood in the past was, by almost every modern standard, extraordinarily harsh, infants died in numbers that are almost incomprehensible to us today. Children as young as 4 and 5 were put to work in fields and workshops. Education was a privilege so rare it might as well have been magic to most children in the ancient and medieval world. Illness came quickly and unpredictably. Winters were genuinely dangerous. A cut or a fever that would earn a modern child a course of antibiotics and a few days of rest might, in another century, be a death sentence. And yet, children in those times were also full of life. They played, they laughed, they made mischief and received punishment and forgave their parents by mourning. They had best friends and favourite games and particular spots by the river or at the edge of the village where they liked to sit. They told each other stories. They were afraid of the dark, just as children are today, and they were comforted by familiar sounds and familiar arms. The contrast is what makes this history so worth sitting with. The harshness and the tenderness woven together, the smallness and the resilience, inseparable. So let us begin at the very beginning. Let us begin with the quietest moment in any child's story, the moment of their arrival into the world. Think of a small house. It might be in ancient Greece, or medieval France, or Tudor England. The walls are whitewashed plaster, or rough-hewn wood, or wattle and daub packed thick against the cold. There is a fire somewhere near the centre of the main room, because there is almost always a fire in these houses. It is the heart of the home, the source of warmth and light and cooked food and safety. The fire crackles. The room smells of smoke and herbs and the animal warmth of human bodies. A woman is in labour. She has been in labour for many hours. The other women of the household, her mother, her mother-in-law, her sisters, the village midwife, are gathered close. The men of the household are outside or in another room waiting. This is women's work, women's world. It has always been. The child comes, and in that moment, as the child takes its first breath and announces itself to the world with its first cry, in that moment, no matter what century we are standing in, no matter what language is being spoken, no matter how simple or elaborate the house, there is joy. There is exhausted, grateful, disbelieving joy. And there is also, already, lurking at the edges of that joy, a fear that would be entirely unfamiliar to most modern parents. The fear that this child may not survive. It is almost impossible for us today to fully comprehend the shadow that infant mortality cast over every birth in the pre-modern world. In ancient Rome, it is estimated that perhaps 20 to 30% of children died before reaching their first birthday. In medieval Europe, the figures were similar, and in some periods and places worse. In many parts of the ancient world, children were not even given names until they had survived the first week of life, because naming a child before that point risked grieving a named person, and that was simply too much to bear. We will spend time with this shadow tonight. We will understand it clearly. And then we will set it gently aside and move into the broader landscape of what it meant to grow up across all the long centuries of human history. Settle a little deeper now. The night is quiet around you. The fire crackles. Let the past come slowly to meet you. The room smells of herbs, lavender and rosemary, and the particular sharp scent of yarrow, which the midwife has been burning in a small clay pot near the door, because it is known to ease the passage of a difficult birth. The floor is covered in fresh straw. Someone has heated water in a heavy iron pot over the fire, and the steam from it rises gently in the candlelit air. The midwife is a woman of perhaps 50. Her hands are experienced and careful. She's been at this work her whole adult life, attending births the way a shepherd attends lambing, with the calm pragmatism of someone who has seen every possible outcome and learned to hold them all without flinching. She knows the herbs, she knows the prayers, she knows when to wait and when to act and when to send for the priest. She hopes, as she always hopes, that it will be straightforward. Throughout most of human history, birth was the most dangerous event in a woman's life and the beginning of a child's most perilous season. The tools available to ease difficulty were limited to folk knowledge, herbal remedies, physical manipulation, and prayer. When things went wrong, when a baby was positioned incorrectly, when a mother's labour stretched on for days, when blood came when it should not, there was very little that anyone could do. This does not mean that midwives were helpless or ignorant. Far from it. The accumulated traditional knowledge of experienced midwives across many cultures was genuinely sophisticated. Ancient Egyptian papyri, some dating to nearly 1700 BCE, describe tests for pregnancy and methods for predicting the sex of a child. The Hippocratic texts in ancient Greece outlined detailed protocols for managing difficult births. In medieval Europe, the tradition of the midwife was so established and so respected that it was legally recognized and regulated in many cities by the 13th and 14th centuries. Frankfurt had official licensed midwives as early as 1452. Many of these women were skilled practitioners whose knowledge, passed down through generations of female apprenticeship, was remarkable. But even skilled hands could not always change outcomes. The leading cause of infant death in the pre-modern world was infection. Newborns had not yet developed the immunity they needed. The umbilical cord was cut with whatever blade was available. A knife, scissors, sometimes a sharpened stone. And infection at that wound alone could kill within days. Tetanus, which we now prevent with a simple vaccination, was a frequent killer of newborns. Respiratory illness, intestinal illness, diarrhea caused by contaminated water, any of these could carry away a child who had arrived perfectly healthy into the world. If a mother died in childbirth, and many did, the newborn's chances dropped dramatically. Without breast milk, keeping a newborn alive was extraordinarily difficult. Cow's milk and goat's milk were sometimes used, and clay-feeding vessels have been found in ancient graves, small bottles shaped to be held by infant hands, sometimes buried with the children who used them. But the nutritional properties of animal milk were not what a newborn needed, and bacterial contamination of unsterilized vessels was an ever-present danger. The institution of the wet nurse existed precisely because of this vulnerability. In households wealthy enough to afford one, a nursing woman would be engaged to breastfeed an infant whose mother could not, or would not. In ancient Rome, wet nurses were a standard feature of upper-class family life. Many Roman women of the wealthy classes chose not to breastfeed themselves. It was considered unfashionable in certain circles associated with the lower classes, and so a slave or a freed woman, herself nursing her own child, would be brought into the household to feed the infant of the family. The relationship between wet nurse and nursling was sometimes extraordinarily close. Ancient sources describe nurses who remained with the family for decades, who were present at their nursling's wedding, who were remembered with deep affection in old age. The Latin poet Horace mentions his nurse fondly. Cicero's letters show genuine warmth toward household figures who had cared for him in infancy. But wet nurses were a privilege of the privileged. For the vast majority of children throughout history, the children of farmers, of labourers, of artisans, of the poor, there was no wet nurse. If a mother died or could not feed her child, the family would do what they could with what they had. Neighbours helped when they could. But the odds for such an infant were not good. Swaddling was almost universal across cultures for the first weeks and months of a baby's life. The ancient practice of wrapping an infant tightly in cloth, restraining the arms and legs, keeping the body warm and the spine straight, was practiced from Egypt to Rome to medieval Europe to the indigenous cultures of North and South America. The reasoning varied by culture. The Romans believed it helped limbs grow straight. Medieval physicians thought it protected the infant from injuring themselves. Some cultures associated the practice with helping the child transition from the constrained space of the womb into the larger world. A swaddled baby could be hung safely on a peg while a mother worked. It could be placed in a carved wooden cradle and rocked. These cradles were often beautiful objects, even in modest households. The making of a cradle for a first child was a matter of some importance. In some cultures, the cradle had a hood carved over one end to protect the baby from drafts. It might be hung from the ceiling beam on a rope, so it could be set swinging with a touch. The sound of the rope creaking, the cradle swaying, the fire crackling. These were the sounds of the earliest nights of countless generations of human babies. Lullabies were everywhere. Every culture developed them independently, and yet they share remarkable characteristics across all of human history. They are slow, they are repetitive, They often speak of sleep as something gentle and desirable. Come, sleep, come and take this child. Hold them gently through the dark. Roman mothers sang lullabies to their children. So did Greek mothers and Egyptian mothers and the mothers of medieval France and England and China and Japan and the countless cultures of sub-Saharan Africa. A fragment of a Greek lullaby survives from antiquity, the nurse singing to the child, promising rest, promising morning. There is something deeply moving in that continuity. The lullaby crosses every boundary of culture and history. It is the sound of human tenderness, unchanged across thousands of years. If the child survived the first week, the first month, the first year, which was far from guaranteed, the nature of the danger shifted but did not disappear. The years of early childhood were still dangerous. Diarrheal illness was a particular killer of toddlers, especially in hot climates where contaminated water supplies were a constant hazard. Measles, whooping cough, and scarlet fever, diseases we now vaccinate against or treat with antibiotics, could sweep through a village and take multiple children from a single family. In ancient Rome, there was a phrase sometimes carved on the gravestones of young children: Vixit, he lived or she lived. Just that one word, with the number of years, sometimes months, sometimes only days. These gravestones are among the most quietly devastating artifacts of the ancient world. They are not dramatic. They do not cry out in grief. They simply mark the fact of a brief existence with a single word. He lived. She lived. In medieval Christian Europe, the death of a very young infant before baptism was considered a matter of special spiritual concern. An unbaptized child could not, according to church doctrine, enter heaven. They would instead inhabit limbo, a theological concept that caused genuine anguish to grieving parents. This belief led to some desperate practices. If a baby appeared to be dying before a priest could arrive, any adult present, even a midwife, was authorized by the church to perform an emergency baptism with whatever water was at hand. There are records of infants being baptized with pond water, well water, even wine, in desperate attempts to secure their spiritual safety. The church eventually softened these positions over the centuries, recognizing the cruelty of the doctrine to grieving families. But for many hundreds of years, the death of an unbaptized infant meant not only the loss of a child, but the specific burning anxiety of not knowing where that child's soul now was. Parents grieved. This is important to say clearly, because there is an old, and largely discredited, historical theory that suggested parents in the past did not form deep attachments to their young children, precisely because infant mortality was so high, that they held themselves back emotionally in a kind of protective numbness. The historian Felipe Arias argued influentially in the 1960s that childhood as a distinct phase of life was essentially invented in the modern period, and that medieval people in particular treated children as simply small adults without particular emotional investment. Later, historians have largely dismantled this view. The evidence, in letters, in diaries, in funerary monuments, in art, in literature, shows clearly that parents across history loved their children with the full force of human attachment. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius records his grief at the deaths of several of his children with a rawness that is entirely recognizable to any modern parent. Medieval chroniclers describe parents weeping over the graves of their children. Excavations of ancient cemeteries reveal that children were buried with toys, with food, with objects that suggest real personal love rather than mere ritual obligation. The high rates of infant mortality made the grief more common, not less. Every family was a family that had likely lost a child, Every mother carried the weight of children who are no longer there. But we do not dwell in that grief tonight. We acknowledge it, because it is true and it is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. And then we move forward, because the children who did survive, who made it past that first terrifying year, went on to live lives that were full, even if they were short. Lives that were hard, even if they contained moments of unexpected sweetness. Let us follow those children forward into the ancient world. The sun is rising over Rome. It is perhaps the year 100 of the Common Era, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan. The city is already beginning to stir. The bakers have been at work since before midnight, and the smell of fresh bread drifts through the morning air. Somewhere a water seller is beginning his rounds. The street vendors are arranging their wares in the long narrow lanes of the Subura, Rome's crowded, chaotic, fascinating heart. In a fourth-floor apartment in an insula, one of Rome's multi-story apartment blocks, crowded and noisy and frequently in danger of collapse, a child of about 6 is waking up. His name, let us say, is Marcus. He is the son of a freedman, a man who was once a slave and is now a craftsman who makes leather goods in a small workshop on the ground floor. His mother manages the household and helps in the workshop. They have 3 rooms. They share a communal latrine with the other residents of the building. They collect water from the street fountain each morning. Marcus does not go to school today. School, in Rome, is theoretically available. There are grammar schools throughout the city, usually held in covered porticos or the back rooms of shops, conducted by a grammaticus, a teacher who may be a freed slave with a good education. For the children of wealthy families, private tutors are employed. But for Marcus, the son of a freedman craftsman, formal education is neither affordable nor particularly expected. What is expected is that he will begin to learn his father's trade. At 6, he is old enough to watch, to run errands, to sort scraps of leather, to carry water from the fountain. He is not yet expected to master any skill, but he is expected to be useful, to be present, and to begin absorbing the rhythms and techniques of the craft that will, in all likelihood, define his working life. This was the almost universal reality of childhood in the ancient world for children who were not wealthy. Education was not the primary business of childhood. Work was. But let us not paint the picture too bleakly for Marcus. Roman childhood, even for children of the working classes, had its pleasures. He has toys. A small wooden horse on wheels with a string to pull it. Some knuckle bones, carved from actual sheep ankle bones, polished smooth by years of play. A leather ball, knuckle bones, astragali in Greek, with a great universal toy of the ancient Mediterranean world, used in games of skill and chance by children across Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the Near East. Thousands of them have been found in archaeological excavations, sometimes in the hands of buried children, placed there by grieving parents who wanted their child to have something familiar to hold in whatever came next. Roman children also played with terracotta dolls with movable limbs, remarkable objects, articulated at the hips and shoulders, sometimes with painted faces and hair made from actual fibres. These dolls were not cheap, which suggests that families across a range of economic levels invested in them. When a Roman girl married, she would dedicate her childhood dolls at the Temple of Venus, a formal ritual that marked the transition from girlhood to womanhood. It is a beautiful ritual when you think about it, a farewell ceremony for childhood itself. Girls and boys played different games, though there was overlap. Ball games were popular for both. Games that involved running, chasing and tagging, recognizable ancestors of games children still play today, are depicted on Roman pottery and described in literature. Children played with hoops, rolling them along the street with a stick. They flew kites. They played with toy chariots and small clay animals. The Roman baths, the great thermae, were social institutions that children were part of. Swimming pools attached to the bath complexes were a feature of larger establishments, and Roman children swam. The poet Ovid describes children playing in water in a way that sounds entirely modern. Horace writes of watching children play in the Tiber, the great river that ran through Rome's heart. The school day, for those children who attended, began at dawn and ended in the early afternoon. The Roman educational system, for those who accessed it, was genuinely rigorous. Primary school focused on reading, writing, and a basic arithmetic. Secondary education, in the hands of a grammaticus, involved the study of literature, particularly Greek literature for wealthy Romans, who considered a knowledge of Greek essential to cultural sophistication, along with rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, which was considered the foundation of civic life. A Roman boy of the upper classes might be sent to Athens or Alexandria for advanced study. Marcus Aurelius, born in 121 CE, received an extraordinarily thorough education, including study with some of the finest philosophers of the age. His meditations, written late in his life, reflect the deep internalization of Stoic philosophy that this education made possible. But again, this was not the experience of most children. For most Roman children, life was a matter of watching, learning, working, and stealing whatever moments of play the day allowed. Now let us drift eastward, across the ancient world, to Egypt. The Nile is flooding, as it does every year between June and September. The farmers of the Delta region have withdrawn to the slightly elevated ground of their villages, while the rich silt of the annual inundation covers their fields, and during this time there is less farm work to be done, and children have somewhat more freedom. An Egyptian child of the New Kingdom, let us say around 1300 BCE, lives in a world that is, in many ways, more comfortable than the world of many other ancient civilizations. Egypt's climate is warm and predictable. Its agricultural system, dependent on the Nile's reliable cycle of flood and recession, produced reliably enough that outright famine, though it occurred during periods of extremely low floods, was not the constant threat it was elsewhere. Egyptian children generally ate well: bread, beer, a thick, nutritious brew quite different from modern beer, consumed by adults and children alike, mixed with water to varying degrees, fish from the river, vegetables, and occasional meat. Egyptian children played with toys that archaeologists have excavated from ancient graves and settlement sites. Wooden animals on wheeled platforms, balls made of leather stuffed with papyrus, spinning tops, and dolls made of wood, clay, and ivory. There is a remarkable crocodile toy from ancient Egypt, carved from wood, with a lower jaw connected to the body by a cord so that when you pulled the cord, the jaw snapped open. It is thousands of years old. It is unmistakably a toy, and it makes you smile because it's easy to imagine a child of 33 centuries ago delighting in exactly the way that a child today would delight in a mechanical animal. Egyptian children swam in the Nile, played in the fields during the flood season, and helped with household tasks that varied by family and gender. Girls helped with cooking, cleaning, and the eternal work of spinning and weaving, which in the ancient world was a constant domestic occupation. Clothing had to be made from raw fibre, washed and mended by hand. Boys helped with herding, farming, and trades. Education in ancient Egypt was primarily vocational and gender-specific. Scribal schools, attached to temples and palaces, trained the sons of officials and wealthy men in the complex system of hieroglyphic and hieratic writing. A student scribe would copy texts over and over, literary works, administrative documents, mathematical tables, until the script became second nature. Scribal wisdom literature survives from ancient Egypt that was used as school texts, instructions from a father to a son, listing the miseries of other occupations and praising the scribal life. The soldier is beaten, the farmer is exhausted, the weaver crouches in an uncomfortable position, but the scribe sits comfortably and tells others what to do. These arguments will be familiar to any parent who has ever tried to convince a reluctant child that education is worth the effort. For children not destined for the scribal class, the great majority, education was informal and practical. A potter's son learned to work clay. A fisherman's son learned the river, the nets, the seasons of different fish. A farmer's daughter learned the rhythms of planting and harvest alongside the household arts. Across the ancient world, in the civilization of Mesopotamia, in the cities of Ur, Babylon, and Nineveh, in the land between the rivers that we now call Iraq, childhood took forms both similar and different. Mesopotamian education was perhaps the most systematized in the ancient world. The aduba, the tablet house, or school, was an institution attached to the great temple complexes and palace administrations. It trained scribes in cuneiform writing, the system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets that was the dominant writing system of the Near East for 3,000 years. Students in the aduba were overwhelmingly male and from elite families, and their education was demanding and strictly enforced. Sumerian school texts survive in remarkable quantities, thousands of clay tablets on which students practiced their writing exercises and recorded the curriculum they were working through. Some of these tablets are funny. Some of them record the complaints of students, the long hours, the demanding teachers, the physical punishment for mistakes. A student text describes a boy's school day with exasperated detail. The early rising, the hurried bread and beer for breakfast, the walk to the tablet house, the copying exercises, the teacher who beats anyone who is late. It reads in many ways like the complaint of a schoolboy in any century. But what is most striking about these tablets is how humanly recognizable they are. Here is a boy, 4,000 years ago, who doesn't want to get up early and go to school. Here is a teacher who is strict and often annoyed. Here is a curriculum of copying and memorizing and being tested and making mistakes and being corrected. It is a very long way from our world, and it is not very far at all. In ancient China, the concept of childhood was filtered through a Confucian lens that emphasized filial piety, the deep, almost sacred obligation of children to their parents, as the foundation of all other virtues. A child in ancient China was expected to be obedient, quiet, and respectful. The expression of individual desire or opinion, particularly in opposition to parental authority, was not encouraged. Chinese children of the elite class studied the Confucian classics from an early age. The texts, the analects, the Book of Rites, the Book of Songs, were memorized, recited, and eventually internalized as the ethical framework of a cultivated person. The examination system that would eventually, in the Tang and Song dynasties, become the pathway to government service was already developing its emphasis on literary and philosophical learning during the Han dynasty. For non-elite Chinese children, life followed the familiar pattern of agricultural and artisan work. Boys helped in the fields, girls helped at home. The rhythms of the agricultural calendar, planting, tending, harvesting, shaped the days of rural children in China just as they shaped the days of rural children everywhere. In ancient Greece, in the city-states of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the dozens of other polis that made up the Greek world, childhood was shaped dramatically by the particular character of each city-state. In Athens, education for boys of the citizen class, and let us be clear, Athenian citizenship was a restricted and exclusive category, including only the sons of free Athenian parents, not slaves, not foreigners, not women, was a matter of considerable importance. The Athenian educational ideal, known as paideia, was the formation of the complete person, physically beautiful and strong, intellectually sharp and literate, musically educated and morally virtuous. It was an ambitious ideal. Boys in Athens attended a palestra, a wrestling school where physical training, wrestling, running, jumping, discus, javelin, occupied much of the day. They also attended lessons in music, learning to play the lyre or the aulos, a double flute, and to sing. And they received instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. A paidagogos, typically a trusted household slave, accompanied a boy from school to home and back, ensuring his safety and modelling decent behaviour. The word pedagogue comes from this practice, literally one who leads the child. For girls in Athens, formal education was minimal. Girls were expected to learn household management, weaving, and the religious observances appropriate to women. Their world was largely confined to the domestic sphere of the oikos, the household. Some exceptional women received more education. Plato believed women were as capable of philosophy as men, but this was not the norm. In Sparta, the picture was entirely different. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the agoge, a rigorous state-sponsored military and educational system designed to produce the legendary Spartan warrior. Boys lived in communal barracks, slept on reed beds, wore the same thin cloak in summer and winter, and were systematically subjected to physical hardship, hunger, and cold. They were not given enough food on purpose. They were expected to supplement their rations by stealing, and if caught, they were punished not for stealing, but for being caught. The Spartans believed that the capacity to endure hardship without complaint was the essential warrior virtue, and they designed childhood specifically to cultivate it. Spartan girls, by contrast, received a remarkable, for the ancient world, degree of physical training. They ran, wrestled, and competed athletically. The Spartans believed that physically strong mothers produced physically strong children. A Spartan woman's social standing was linked to her ability to produce healthy warriors for the state. The agoge would strike us today as deeply disturbing, a system of state kidnapping of children, systematic abuse, and the deliberate destruction of family bonds in service of military production. And yet the Spartans themselves venerated it, and the Spartan reputation for discipline, courage, and military effectiveness was acknowledged throughout the ancient world. The word Spartan still carries, 3,000 years later, the connotation of austere, demanding simplicity. Even in Greece, childhood was not a protected category. It was a preparation for adult life, and adult life was demanding. A village in northern France. The year is perhaps 1150. The snow came early this year in October, and it has not fully melted. The fields are bare. The animals, the ox, the 2 pigs, the small flock of sheep, are in the byre attached to the side of the house, and their warmth radiates through the shared wall. The house is one room. It has a fire in the centre, a hole in the roof above it to let out smoke. The floor is earth, covered with rushes. The furniture is minimal, a trestle table, a few stools, a chest for clothing and important objects, the big bed in the corner where the parents sleep, and the straw pallets around the fire where the children sleep. There are 5 children. The eldest is 12, a girl named Margot, who is already helping her mother with almost all the household work and is beginning to be spoken of in the village as a girl of marriageable age. The youngest is 2, a boy with the name, but everyone calls him Le Petit, the little one, because he is still the baby, and because giving him his full name somehow feels like tempting fate. Between them are 3 more, a boy of 10, a girl of 8, a girl of 5. They are awake early, because in winter, when the days are short and light is precious, you are awake when there is light, and you sleep when there is not. The fire needs building up. The animals need feeding. The water needs fetching from the well, and the well is not near. The 10-year-old boy has been working with his father since he was 7. His father's trade is farming. They have a strip of land in the open field system that governs agriculture in this part of France. And the farming year is the structure around which all of life is organised. Ploughing in late winter, sowing in spring, weeding through summer, harvesting in late summer and early autumn, and then the long, slow winter, when there is repair work to do, tool maintenance, animal care, and the slow burning of time until the cycle begins again. The boy knows how to plough, though he's still too small to guide the heavy iron-tipped plough alone. He knows how to sow, scattering grain from a bag slung across his body in a practiced arc, the way his father taught him. He knows how to swing a sickle, though his arms tire faster than his father's. He is, in most practical respects, a junior member of the adult labour force of the village. This was the fundamental reality of medieval childhood for the vast majority of Europe's population. Children were workers. They were small workers with less strength and stamina than adults, but workers nonetheless. Their childhood was not a protected period of play and development. It was an apprenticeship in the skills and habits that would sustain them and their families through adult life. The church was a constant presence in medieval childhood. Not the distant institutional church of doctrine and theology, though children were baptized, catechized, and expected to observe the liturgical calendar, but the lived rhythmic church of the village. The bell of the parish church marked the hours. Sunday Mass was obligatory. Feast days, and there were many scattered through the year like resting places, broke the monotony of work with celebration, processions, special food, and the temporary suspension of labour. For a medieval child, the church's calendar was the calendar, Advent and Christmas, Lent and Easter, the feasts of the local saints who protected the village, the Feast of the Assumption in August, Michaelmas in September. These were not abstract religious observances. They were the framework of time itself, the points by which seasons and years were reckoned. And the feast days, with their music and food and dancing and colour, were among the genuine pleasures of medieval childhood. The concept of formal education for medieval children was closely linked to the church. Cathedral schools, schools attached to the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, educated the boys who were intended for the clergy. The curriculum was built around the trivium, grammar, rhetoric and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. This was the inheritance of classical learning, preserved and transmitted through the church during the centuries when broader literacy had contracted sharply across Western Europe. For children not destined for the church, again the great majority, education was informal, practical, and entirely domestic. A girl learned from her mother, a boy learned from his father. Guilds had apprenticeship systems by which boys of perhaps 12 or 14 might be placed with a craftsman to learn a trade over several years. But before that, their education was simply the lived experience of watching and participating in the work of the household. Childhood in medieval Europe was also deeply marked by social class in ways that are important to understand. The experience of a noble child was drastically different from the experience of a peasant child. But perhaps the most telling thing is that the harshness of medieval childhood was felt at almost every level of the social hierarchy. Even the children of noble families were subject to practices that would horrify modern parents. It was common for noble children to be sent away from their families at a young age, girls sometimes as young as 8 or 9, to serve in the households of other noble families where they would learn courtly manners, household management, music, and the social skills appropriate to their class. A noble boy might be sent as a page at the age of 7, beginning his long training in the arts of war and courtly service. He would not see his own family except on special occasions. This was considered entirely appropriate and indeed beneficial. The logic was pragmatic. Children in another household would receive more rigorous training and would form connections that would serve them in adult life. But by any modern standard, it was a removal of the child from the primary attachments of family life at a critically tender age. Medieval peasant children were subject to different but equally demanding expectations. They worked. They worked constantly. They worked in the fields during the growing season, helping with every stage of agriculture from ploughing to harvest. They worked in the household, spinning, weaving, cooking, cleaning, fetching water and firewood. They tended animals. Girls of 10 or 11 might already be responsible for the care of younger siblings, effectively mothers in training from childhood. Boys of the same age were working alongside men at tasks that required real physical effort, and they did this without many of the protections that modern children take for granted. There were no child labour laws. There were no regulations about the number of hours a child could work or the type of work they could be required to do. There was no concept of childhood as a protected period. If a child could do the work, the child did the work. Illness moved through medieval villages with terrifying speed and efficiency. The Black Death of the 1340s, the Great Bubonic Plague that killed between a third and half of Europe's population in the space of a few years, was particularly devastating for children because their immune systems were less developed. But even without plague, the ordinary run of medieval illness was deadly. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, measles. Children died from illnesses that are now either preventable or easily treatable. A winter with a hard cough or a summer with bad water could carry away a child in days. The medieval church, trying to make sense of this suffering, offered theological frameworks that were sometimes comforting and sometimes additionally painful. The death of a child was God's will. It was a mystery beyond human understanding. A dead child was an angel in heaven, looking down on the family with love. These frameworks helped some families to carry their grief. They were sometimes inadequate to the rawness of what loss actually felt like. But children were also baptized, named, confirmed, taught to pray. They had a spiritual life that was woven through their daily life in ways we might find unfamiliar, but that were genuinely meaningful to them. The prayer said before sleep, which every medieval child would have known, were a form of comfort, a ritual of surrender to the night. God would watch over them while they slept. The saints would intercede. Morning would come. Let us rest there for a moment. In a medieval village, in the deep of a winter night, the fire burns low. The children are asleep on their pallets. The youngest breathes softly, one small fist curled near his face. Outside, the snow is falling again, and the village is very quiet. And across the fields, in the church, the night bell will ring at matins 3 hours before dawn. But for now there is just the warmth of the fire, and the sound of sleeping children, and the long winter night holding everything gently in its cold, dark arms. Let us speak plainly for a moment about what it actually felt like to be a child in much of human history. Not in a frightening way, just clearly, because the reality deserves to be understood, not softened into something it wasn't. Child labour in the pre-modern world was not an aberration or an abuse, it was the norm. Children were economic assets. In agricultural societies, every additional pair of hands was valuable. Children who could help in the fields, tend the animals, carry water, watch younger siblings, or contribute to any form of domestic production were contributing to the survival of the family unit. This was understood, and it was expected, and children largely accepted it because they had no framework for anything different. In the cities of early modern Europe, the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, child labour in workshops and trades was equally normal. A goldsmith's son might begin to work the bellows in his father's workshop at the age of 5 or 6. A weaver's daughter would be spinning before she was 8. The trades and guilds of pre-industrial Europe were built on a scaffolding of child and adolescent labour. The apprenticeship system, which became formalised in medieval Europe, was a specific legal and social arrangement by which a boy, usually between the ages of 12 and 14, though sometimes younger, was bound to a master craftsman for a period of years, typically 7. During this time, the apprentice lived in his master's household, worked for no wages, receiving only board and lodging, learned the craft and was subject to his master's authority in almost all things. The legal documents that governed apprenticeships are sobering to read. The master had the right to discipline the apprentice physically. The apprentice could be returned to his parents if he proved incorrigible, but this was considered a humiliation for the family. A good apprentice was obedient, diligent, quiet, and grateful. An apprentice who complained was a bad apprentice. Some masters were genuinely kind and treated their apprentices like members of the household. Some were exploitative and brutal. The apprentice had limited recourse in either case, because the legal and social power was entirely with the master. What makes this difficult for us to sit with is that this was considered entirely appropriate, not just by those who profited from it, but by society in general, including often by the families of the apprentices themselves. A boy placed with a good master in a reputable trade had been given a significant gift. He had a future, he had a path. The hardship of the apprenticeship years was the price of that future, and most families considered it worth paying. For girls, the transition to adult labour happened even earlier, and without the formal structure of apprenticeship. Girls in domestic service, working as servants in wealthier households, might be sent away at the age of 12 or 13. They would cook, clean, launder, and assist in whatever way was needed. They lived in the household of their employer. They sent their small wages home to their families. They were, in most practical respects, working adults before they were teenagers. This early entry into adult labour meant that the transition from childhood to adulthood was not the long, gradual process we think of today. There was no adolescence as a recognised category. You were a child, dependent and under the authority of parents, and then fairly quickly you were a working person with responsibilities and obligations. The transition might happen at 12 or 14 or 16, but it happened, and it was often marked by physical removal from the family home. Physical punishment of children was universal and generally considered appropriate. The spare the rod, spoil the child principle, derived from biblical proverbs, was taken literally in many cultures and periods. Schoolmasters beat their students. Masters beat their apprentices, parents beat their children. The instruments of punishment range from the palm of a hand to wooden paddles, leather straps, and canes. The birch rod was so common in English schools that birching became a synonym for school punishment. This is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the tenderness that also clearly existed in many parent-child relationships across history. Both things were true simultaneously. Parents who loved their children deeply and who also physically punished them as a matter of course, and considered this both appropriate and necessary. The psychological tension in this, the way that love and violence coexisted in the daily lives of children, is something we're still working through as a society even today. Disease was the great constant shadow over childhood. In the absence of germ theory, which was not fully developed until the latter half of the 19th century, and not widely applied in medicine until the early 20th, the causes of illness were misunderstood, and the treatments were often ineffective or actively harmful. Children were treated with herbal remedies that sometimes helped, with purgatives and bleedings that often weakened them further, with prayers and amulets and holy water that offered comfort if not cure. The smallpox that swept periodically through populations was particularly devastating for children, killing some and leaving many survivors badly scarred. Scarlet fever was a serious killer. Diphtheria, which creates a membrane in the throat that slowly closes off breathing, could kill a child within a week of the first symptoms appearing. Whooping cough, so named for the desperate characteristic whoop as children gasp for breath between fits of violent coughing, was particularly dangerous for infants and toddlers. A bad summer could mean a bad water supply. A bad water supply could mean dysentery sweeping through a community and killing the weakest, the very young, the very old. In cities where water supplies were more likely to be contaminated by human waste, intestinal illness was a constant presence. The Great Stink of London in 1858, when the Thames ran with sewage and the smell permeated the entire city, finally galvanised Parliament to build the sewage system that would dramatically reduce waterborne disease in the capital. Before that system was built, the Thames was the water supply for much of London's population, and the death rate from waterborne disease reflected it. Accidents were another constant presence. In a world where so much work involved fire, sharp tools, animals, water and heights, children were regularly injured. Burns from open fires were extremely common. A child who fell into or against a hearth could sustain terrible injuries, and the infections that followed burns were often more dangerous than the burns themselves. A child who fell from a cart or was kicked by a horse or slipped into a mill race or a canal was in genuine danger because the treatments available for serious trauma injuries were minimal. We should not romanticize this. It was genuinely hard. It was dangerous in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend from our cushioned modern vantage point. And yet, children lived. They survived, and they grew, and they found ways to experience joy in the middle of all of it. The harshness of the world could not, prevent children from being children, from playing and laughing and fighting with their siblings and being afraid of things that weren't there and being surprised by things that were. Children are resilient in ways that are sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes deeply inspiring. The capacity to find delight even in a limited and difficult world is perhaps the most particularly and powerfully human thing about us. In the long sweep of human history, formal education, the kind where a child goes to a specific building, sits with the teacher and a group of peers, and receives structured instruction in reading, writing, and a body of organized knowledge, has been the exception rather than the rule. For most children, for most of human history, education was life itself. You learned by watching and doing. You learned by making mistakes and being corrected. You learned by following the adults around you through the rhythms of the day and the year, gradually taking on more responsibility as your body and abilities grew. This kind of education was not inferior in all respects. A child who learned to farm by farming from the age of 6 had a depth and texture of agricultural knowledge by adolescence that no classroom could have produced. A child who learned to weave by weaving knew the feel and behaviour of different fibres, the way different dyes affected different materials, the 1,000 small adjustments of tension and rhythm that made the difference between good cloth and bad cloth, in a way that was entirely practical and entirely real. But it also meant that certain kinds of knowledge, reading, writing, mathematics, history, geography, science, remained inaccessible to the vast majority of human beings for most of history. The ability to read and write was a specialized skill held by a minority. Priests and monks, scribes and administrators, scholars and lawyers. This minority could access the accumulated written knowledge of their civilization. Everyone else could not. This division had profound consequences. It meant that ordinary people were dependent on those with literacy for access to legal documents, religious texts, and administrative processes. It meant that a peasant who was cheated in a legal contract had no way to read the document that was being enforced against him. It meant that the Bible, the central religious text of medieval Christendom, was accessible in its written form only to those who could read Latin, which was essentially only the clergy and the learned. The spread of literacy in Europe accelerated dramatically following the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg around 1440. Suddenly, books were cheaper, more available and more numerous. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century had a particular impact on literacy, because reformers like Martin Luther insisted that every Christian should be able to read the Bible in their own language. This created a strong religious motivation for basic literacy that helped push education beyond the narrow circle of the clergy. But even in the post-Reformation period, formal schooling remained patchy, inconsistent and class-dependent. In England in the 17th century, it is estimated that perhaps 30% of men and 10% of women could sign their own names, itself a rough proxy for basic literacy. In rural areas, rates were lower. Among the poor, lower still. The dame school was a common feature of English village life from the 16th through the 18th centuries. A woman, often elderly and of limited education herself, would gather a group of children in her home or cottage and teach them the basics of reading and perhaps writing for a small fee. The instruction was rudimentary, often limited to the alphabet, basic syllable recognition, and reading from a hornbook, a small wooden paddle with a sheet of printed letters covered by a transparent layer of horn to protect it. Many children who attended dame schools learned just enough to read simple texts and then went no further. Grammar schools, which in England were established in considerable numbers in the 16th century, partly through royal endowment and partly through local charity, provided a more rigorous education in Latin grammar and literature. These schools were theoretically open to boys of any class who could pass an entrance requirement, but in practice, boys from poor families who might have the intellectual ability rarely had the economic freedom to attend. They were needed at work. For girls, formal schooling of any kind was unusual until well into the modern period. The education of girls was considered primarily the responsibility of the home, and it was oriented toward domestic skills, cooking, sewing, basic household management, and in higher class households, music, drawing, and enough French and Italian to be considered accomplished. The idea that a girl might receive the same intellectual education as a boy was considered eccentric at best and dangerous at worst. Even in the early 19th century, when the movement for women's education was gaining momentum, the arguments against it were still based in the fear that educating women would make them unfit for domestic life and marriage. There were exceptions always. Some convents provided excellent education for girls in their care. Some families, particularly those with Quaker or dissenting religious backgrounds in England, or some of the intellectual Protestant families of the Netherlands, educated their daughters seriously. Mary Wollstonecraft, writing her Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, was building on a tradition of female learning that existed but was isolated and exceptional. The experience of a child who could not read, which was the experience of most children for most of history, was not simply a privation, though it was that. It was also a different relationship with knowledge and culture. In the oral tradition, stories were the primary vehicle for transmitting understanding of the world. A child who could not read the Bible could nonetheless hear it read aloud in church each Sunday, interpreted by the priest, woven into the fabric of the liturgy. A child who could not read historical chronicles nonetheless knew history, the history of the village, of the region, of the saints and kings, through songs and stories told by elders. A child who had never seen a map of the world nonetheless understood the geography of their immediate world with an intimacy that no map could fully capture. Oral culture is not inferior culture. It is a different kind of culture, with its own forms of sophistication and depth. The bards of medieval Wales, the griots of West Africa, the storytellers of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, these were practitioners of an art that required extraordinary memory, skill, and cultural knowledge. The stories they told were not mere entertainment. They were the libraries of their communities, the repositories of everything that mattered to be remembered and understood. A child who grew up in this world was not empty. They were full of stories, of songs, of practical knowledge, of the specific geography and botany and animal behaviour of the world around them. They simply held their knowledge in different forms. In the midst of all this work, in the spaces between labour and obligation, in the long summer evenings after the day's chores were done, in the winter afternoons when the short light failed and there was nothing more to do in the fields, in the quiet of Sunday afternoons after church, children played. This is one of the most humanly recognisable and deeply touching aspects of childhood across all history. No matter how hard the life, no matter how early the responsibilities began, children found ways to play. They are constitutionally, biologically designed for it. Play is how children learn, how they process their world, how they exercise and rehearse and imagine. You cannot take it out of them, no matter how demanding the circumstances. The toys that children played with throughout history were simpler than what we know today, but they were not without ingenuity and charm. Dolls are among the most ancient of toys. Dolls made of cloth, wood, clay, and bone have been found in the graves of children across every ancient civilization. Egyptian dolls with painted features and hair made from threads of actual hair. Roman terracotta dolls with movable limbs, some with sets of tiny wooden furniture. Medieval cloth dolls with embroidered faces. Early modern carved wooden dolls with painted cheeks. Each of these toys represents an act of creation, an adult or older sibling, or the child herself making something to love and play with. The very act of making a toy for a child is an act of love, and these objects carry that love forward through the centuries in a way that is quietly powerful. Bulls were universal, made of leather, bladders, rubber in the Americas, wound cloth, or wood. Bulls were thrown, kicked, rolled, and chased by children in every culture and period. Bull games requiring a stick, ancestors of hockey and polo and cricket, appear in medieval illuminations and ancient Egyptian paintings with remarkable similarity. Spinning tops, discovered independently across many cultures, appear in the archaeological record from the ancient Near East, Egypt, Greece, China, and the pre-Columbian Americas. A top is a beautiful thing. It spins with surprising stability, wobbles, slows, and falls, and can be set spinning again. The physical pleasure of setting a top going and watching it maintain its impossible balance is perfectly designed to enchant a child. Knuckle bones, 5 small bones from the ankle of a sheep or other animal, or small stones or clay pieces shaped to mimic them, were the great universal game of the ancient and medieval world. The game was played in dozens of variations, tossing the pieces in the air and catching them on the back of the hand, picking up pieces from the floor while holding another in the air, arranging them in specific patterns. Knucklebones required skill, practice, and good reflexes, and it was portable. You could play it anywhere, with no preparation required. Thousands of sets have been found by archaeologists, often in children's graves. Marbles, small spheres of stone, clay, or glass, appear throughout the ancient world and the medieval period. Rolling marbles, flicking marbles, aiming marbles at targets or at other marbles. These games were played by children in ancient Rome and in medieval Florence and in 17th century Amsterdam. The game is simple and endlessly varied, and the satisfying click of one marble striking another has probably delighted children for thousands of years. Kite flying was invented in China, where there is evidence of kite making and flying that stretches back at least 2,000 years, and possibly much further. Kites spread along the trade routes of Asia and eventually reached Europe. For a child in a world without mechanical toys, without electronic entertainment, without any of the spectacular stimulations of modern life, a kite was almost miraculous. Something that could fly. Something that pulled against your hand with the living tension. Something that danced with the wind. In the evenings, particularly in winter, when darkness came early and the family was gathered around the fire, storytelling was the primary entertainment. Every culture, in every period, had its tradition of stories told to children. Not the sanitized fairy tales of the modern Disney tradition, but stories that were often darker, stranger, and more morally complex. Stories designed to educate children about the dangers of the world, the forest, the river, the stranger on the road, as well as to entertain them. In medieval Europe, the stories that circulated among common people were folk tales that were later collected and somewhat softened by collectors like Charles Perrault in 17th century France, and later by the Brothers Grimm in 19th century Germany. The original versions of many familiar tales were considerably darker than what we know today. Cinderella's stepsisters, in early versions, have their eyes pecked out by birds at the wedding. The original Sleeping Beauty is not woken by a kiss, but by the birth of the children she has while asleep, a disturbing detail that was quite deliberate in the original telling. Little Red Riding Hood, in Perrault's version, is simply eaten. There is no rescue. These stories were not told to traumatize children. They were told to warn them. In a world where the forest really was dangerous, where strangers really could be threats, where young girls really were vulnerable in specific ways. These stories were education as much as entertainment. They were ways of transmitting accumulated social knowledge about real dangers in a form that children could absorb and remember. The ghost stories and monster legends that every culture has developed are also partly educational. Fear of the dark, of the deep water, of the edge of the village. These fears serve a protective function in children who live in genuinely dangerous environments. In a world without electric lights, the dark really was full of things that could hurt you. Wolves, brigands, falls into unmarked holes. Keeping children appropriately cautious about darkness and wilderness was a survival strategy, and the stories that maintained that caution were a tool of that strategy. But not all stories were warnings. Some were just wonderful. The Norse sagas told to children around Viking hearth fires were full of adventure, magic, gods, and giants. The tales of Scheherazade circulating throughout the Islamic world were full of wonder and intrigue. The Jataka tales of Buddhist tradition, telling the past lives of the Buddha in the form of animals and humans, were deeply moral and also deeply engaging stories full of clever animals and surprising reversals of fortune. And there was music. Always music. In every culture, in every period, children sang and danced. They sang work songs and game songs. They danced in circles at village festivals. They banged on pots and blew on pipes and scraped strings, and made the noise that children make when they're given the opportunity to be loud and joyful. Music was not a separate activity from daily life. It was woven through it, marking the seasons, the feasts, the rituals, the working rhythms of the day. These moments of play and music and story, they were not a large proportion of a child's day. Work claimed more of it, obligation more, sleep more. But they were real, and they mattered, and they were, in many ways, the same as what children seek and need today. Morning in a medieval house comes in layers. The cock crows before dawn, and one by one the members of the household begin to stir. The fire from the night before has burned to embers, and the first task of the morning is to build it back up, carefully, because fire is precious, and getting it started from cold is laborious. The eldest child, who is old enough and trusted enough, has this responsibility, or the mother, depending on the household. While the fire builds, someone goes to fetch water from the well or the stream or the fountain. This is often a child's task. It is daily, repetitive, and heavy enough to be considered worth assigning to a young person. The water is heavy. The buckets are carried on a yoke across the shoulders. Breakfast is simple and the same every day. Bread, if there is bread. Porridge, oat or barley in Northern Europe, millet or sorghum in Africa, corn in the Americas after it spread from the New World. Some kind of beverage, weak ale in medieval England. Water was frequently unsafe. A light fermented drink was safer. Water mixed with vinegar in the Roman tradition. Tea in China. In better-off households, some fat, some cheese, perhaps an egg. For the poor, the bread and the porridge and the drink. Then work begins. In agricultural households, the shape of the day was largely determined by season. In spring and summer, everyone who could walk went to the fields. Children of 5 and 6 had tasks they could manage. Scaring birds from newly sown seed was a classic child's task, and it was an important one, because a field with its seed stolen by birds was a field that might not yield enough to feed the family through winter. A child armed with a rattle or a stick, walking the perimeter of a field and making noise, was performing real agricultural work. Older children worked alongside adults at planting, weeding, and harvesting. The harvest, in particular, was an all-hands event that involved the entire community, often including children from several different households working together in neighbouring fields. It was hard, physical work in whatever weather August and September chose to provide. But it was also a social occasion, with food and drink brought to the field, songs sung to maintain the rhythm of work, and the genuine satisfaction of visible, tangible, collective achievement at the end of the day. In winter, when the outdoor work was reduced, the household turned inward. Spinning and weaving filled enormous amounts of time. Fibre, wool, flax, hemp needed to be processed, spun into thread, and then woven into cloth, because cloth was expensive to buy, and almost every family produced much of its own. Spinning was a task that could be done by children as young as 8 or 9. The spindle whorl, a simple weighted stick that twisted fibre into thread, is one of the most common artifacts found in archaeological sites of every culture and period, a testament to how universal and constant this work was. Girls in particular were expected to be constantly spinning when they were not doing other work. The word spinster originally meant simply a woman who spins, a descriptor for unmarried women who were assumed to be occupied with this work, and the image of the spinning woman, distaff in hand, was so universal that it became a symbol of femininity in many cultures. Boys in winter were occupied with repair work, mending tools, repairing fences and structures, caring for the animals who were brought inside. The care of animals was particularly important, because in a world where farm animals were both economic assets and, in some cases, beloved companions, their survival through winter mattered intensely. Bedtime in a medieval or early modern household was early by modern standards. Candles were expensive. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were cheap but smoky and smelly. Beeswax candles were more pleasant but much more expensive, and so the household generally went to bed when it became too dark to see to work, rather than burning candlelight unnecessarily. In winter, this might mean retiring as early as 7 or 8 in the evening. In summer, the long daylight hours meant working later and sleeping less. The sleeping arrangements of most historical households would strike us as remarkably close. The entire family typically slept in the same room, often in the same bed, or at least on pallets arranged close together for warmth. In wealthy households, separate bedrooms existed, but even in wealthy medieval homes, it was common for servants, children, and occasionally guests to share sleeping spaces. The nuclear family in its own sealed private bedroom is a fairly recent invention. Children slept with their parents, with each other, and in larger households, with servants. The warmth and proximity of multiple bodies in an era before central heating was not merely a social custom. It was a survival strategy. Hypothermia was a real risk in northern European winters, especially for the very young and the very old. The sounds of a medieval night were very different from the sounds of a modern night. No traffic, no electrical hum, no distant machinery. The sounds were wind, rain, the creak of timber, the movement of animals in the byre, the call of an owl, the bark of a dog somewhere in the village, and the sounds of the people around you, breathing, shifting, the small murmurs of sleeping children. It was very quiet in the past, and very dark when the fire burned low. Childhood ended quickly in the pre-modern world. There was no slow graduation from child to adult. There was no extended adolescence in which a young person explored their identity and gradually took on adult responsibilities. The transition was more abrupt, more clearly marked, and more final than anything we experience today. For girls, the transition was often tied explicitly to biological change. The onset of menstruation, the menarche, was the recognized signal that a girl was now a woman and could marry. In many historical cultures, a girl who had reached the menarche was considered of marriageable age regardless of her actual years. In medieval Europe, the canonical marriageable age for girls was 12, the age at which, according to church law, girls were considered to have reached puberty. Boys had to be 14. These were minimum ages, and in practice marriages below these ages were not common for most of the population. The expense of establishing a household, meant that most couples married somewhat later, in their late teens or early 20s. But among the nobility and royalty, political alliances made early betrothals common, and girls might be formally betrothed as children, with the actual marriage and consummation expected at the canonical minimum. The famous case of Romeo and Juliet, whatever its fictional status, is actually quite realistic in its depiction of the Capulet family's expectations for their 13-year-old daughter. Juliet's father considers her young, but does not consider her too young for marriage, and this reflects the actual social norms of Renaissance Italy quite accurately. Lady Capulet's speech, in which she mentions her own early marriage, "I was your mother much upon these years, that you are now a maid," is a reflection of genuine historical practice. For girls of the lower classes, the transition to adult life often came through service rather than marriage. Leaving home at 12 or 13 to work as a domestic servant in another household was an ordinary feature of working-class life across early modern Europe. The girl who went into service retained her childhood in the memories and the relationships of home, but her daily life was entirely adult. Adult work, adult hours, adult responsibilities. For boys, the transition was typically marked by the beginning of formal work or apprenticeship. A boy who was apprenticed at 14 was, in legal and social terms, a working adult. He might not be fully physically mature. Boys in many historical periods are estimated to have reached physical maturity somewhat later than modern boys, partly due to nutritional factors, but he was treated as a junior adult, with adult obligations if not yet adult authority. In some cultures, coming of age was marked by specific rituals designed to formally sever the child's status and establish the adult's. In ancient Rome, a boy's coming of age was marked by the donning of the toga virilis, the adult toga, typically at around 15 or 16, in a ceremony attended by family and friends. The boy's childhood bulla, a small golden or bronze pendant worn since infancy for protection, was laid aside, offered to the household gods or hung in a place of honour. It was a beautiful ritual, a formal acknowledgement of the passage of time and the changing of status. The Jewish bar mitzvah, which formally establishes a boy as a member of the adult religious community at the age of 13, is one of the oldest and most durable coming-of-age rituals in the world. The obligation to observe religious law, which before 13 falls on the parents, passes to the child himself at this moment. It is, at its heart, a ritual of responsibility, the moment at which a person formally accepts the obligations of adult moral and religious life. Indigenous cultures around the world developed elaborate coming-of-age rituals that were often far more demanding than anything in Western tradition. Vision quests, in various Native American traditions, required a young person to go alone into the wilderness for days without food, seeking a spiritual vision that would guide their adult life. The initiation rituals of many African cultures involved periods of separation from the community, often combined with physical tests and the transmission of secret knowledge available only to adults. These rituals were not casual. They were genuinely transformative experiences, designed to create an irreversible change in how the young person understood themselves and their place in the community. The end of childhood, in all these traditions, was not the loss of something precious. It was an advancement into something more important. This is a crucial distinction from how we tend to think about growing up today, when there is often a nostalgic sadness about the end of childhood, a sense of loss. In most historical cultures, the movement into adulthood was a promotion. It meant being trusted with real responsibility, real authority, real purpose. It meant being taken seriously. It meant being a full member of the community. For children who had spent their early years as junior members of the labour force, the moment of being recognised as a genuine adult worker, someone whose skill and judgment were worth real deference, was a moment of genuine pride. We've established the broad landscape of childhood in the past. The harshness, the work, the mortality, the love, the play, the ritual. Now let us move through it more gently, touching on the particular stories and particular worlds that fill out the picture with colour and detail. Let us travel east now, far east, to the Indian subcontinent, where one of the world's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations was shaping the lives of its youngest members in ways both familiar and surprising. In the cities of the Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, flourishing between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE, archaeologists have found toys that are among the oldest in the world. Small-wheeled carts, some pulled by strings, animals fashioned from fired clay, bulls, birds, dogs, sometimes with movable heads, whistles in the shapes of birds, small model carts that may have been pulled by actual bullocks in miniature, a remarkable cart with a yoke designed to hold tiny clay oxen survives from Mohenjo-Daro, delicate, intricate, clearly made with care and skill. The discovery of these toys in such abundance suggests a society where childhood was recognized as distinct and where the pleasures of the very young were considered worth investing in. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro were laid out in a grid, with sophisticated drainage systems that were not equalled in Europe for thousands of years. In such a city, children would have played in those streets, in the courtyards of the well-appointed houses, by the great tank that dominated the city's ceremonial centre. When the later Vedic civilization emerged in the subcontinent, the culture whose texts form the foundation of Hinduism, childhood was structured by the elaborate system of the ashramas, the 4 stages of life. The first stage was brahmacharya, the period of studentship, typically beginning between the ages of 8 and 12, in which a boy of the upper 3 castes would leave his family and live with a teacher, the guru, learning the Vedic texts through oral recitation and memorization. This education was genuinely demanding. The Vedic texts, the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Atharva Veda, are among the most extensive bodies of oral literature in the world, and they were memorized in their entirety by students of sufficient ability and dedication. The memorization was exact in a way that modern readers find almost impossible to comprehend, because the sacred nature of the texts meant that a single mispronounced syllable was considered a ritual error. Students developed sophisticated systems of cross-checking recitation to ensure accuracy, some of which survive in practice among certain communities of Vedic priests in India today. The period of brahmacharya was one of simplicity and discipline. The student ate simple food, wore plain clothes, swept the guru's house, tended the sacred fire, and devoted himself entirely to learning. He was expected to be celibate, modest, and obedient. The relationship between guru and disciple was one of the most important in Indian social life, more intimate in some ways than the relationship between parent and child, because the guru shaped the student's intellectual and spiritual self in ways that parents could not. Girls in ancient India occupied a complex position. In the earliest Vedic period, there is some evidence for female students and even female composers of Vedic hymns, a remarkable figure called Gargi, who appears in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad debating philosophy with the sage Yajnavalkya, represents the tradition of the educated, intellectually active woman that existed in the earliest period of Indian civilization. But over time, and particularly from the later Vedic period onward, the opportunities for women's formal education contracted, The system of child marriage, girls betrothed and married before puberty, which became increasingly common in the later period, was incompatible with the extended period of brahmacharya, and so girls were largely excluded from it. Across the Indian Ocean trade routes, on the great continent of Africa, childhood was being lived in dozens of different ways by hundreds of different peoples. Africa's enormous cultural diversity makes generalizations dangerous, but certain patterns recur across many of the continent's traditional cultures in ways that suggest deep commonalities in how childhood was understood. The extended family, often much larger and more structurally complex than the Western nuclear family, was almost universally the primary unit of child rearing. A child was not simply the responsibility of its biological parents, but of a network of uncles, aunts, grandparents, and older siblings who shared in the work of raising, educating, and protecting the young. The proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child," often attributed generically to African wisdom, actually reflects a genuine structural reality of many African traditional societies, where child rearing really was a collective enterprise in ways that Western societies have never quite managed. This communal approach to childhood meant that children were rarely isolated. They were always surrounded by people of multiple ages, always part of an ongoing web of relationships and obligations. The separation and loneliness that can afflict modern children, particularly in urban nuclear family settings, was structurally impossible in a world where you were simply always embedded in a large family group. Education in traditional African societies was embedded in daily life and transmitted through participation, observation, and structured initiation. The initiation ceremonies that mark the transition from childhood to adulthood were among the most important events in many African cultures, events that involved extended periods of separation from the community, physical tests, the transmission of sacred or secret knowledge, and eventual reintegration as a recognized adult member of the community. The specifics varied enormously. Among the Ndebele and Zulu peoples of southern Africa, initiation involved extended periods of seclusion and instruction in adult responsibilities and values. Among the Krobo people of Ghana, the female initiation ceremony, the Dipo, was an elaborate multi-day event involving special clothing, instruction in adult womanhood, and public celebration. Among the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, the male initiation from warrior youth to elder status involves specific tests of courage and endurance. These ceremonies were not mere ritual for its own sake. They were educational events, carefully structured to transmit the specific knowledge, values, and skills that would make a child into a functional adult member of the community. And they were deeply meaningful to the participants, transformative experiences that permanently altered how a person understood themselves and their place in the world. The oral literary traditions of African societies were another crucial vehicle for children's education. Folk tales, the tales of Anansi the spider in West African and Caribbean traditions, the stories of the hare and the lion in East and Southern Africa, the tales of the tortoise in Nigerian tradition, were stories that contained specific moral and social lessons wrapped in entertainment that made them memorable and pleasurable. Children who grew up hearing these stories absorbed complex ethical frameworks, along with the pleasure of the narrative itself. Along the great trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean world, the network of paths we call the Silk Road, children of many different cultures lived in a world shaped by the movement of goods, ideas, and people across enormous distances. A child born in the great trading city of Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, in the 9th or 10th century CE grew up in one of the most cosmopolitan environments the pre-modern world offered. Samarkand stood at the intersection of routes connecting China, India, Persia, and the eastern edge of the Islamic world. Its markets contained silk from China, spices from India, glassware from Persia, and the products of a dozen other civilizations. Its population was ethnically and religiously diverse in ways that would have been remarkable by the standards of most of the world. A child in such a city might grow up speaking several languages, the Sogdian or Persian of their family, the Arabic of religious life and trade, perhaps some Chinese or Indian words absorbed from the merchants who passed through. They would have encountered foods, fabrics, musical instruments, and ideas from cultures very different from their own, simply by walking through the market. This cosmopolitanism extended to religious life. The Silk Road was a conduit for the spread of ideas as well as goods, and the great world religions, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, all travelled its routes. A child in Samarkand might have Buddhist shrines in one neighbourhood and a mosque in another, and a Nestorian Christian church in a third. This religious diversity was, for most of the road's history, managed with a pragmatic tolerance, born of the recognition that trade required cooperation across religious boundaries. The children of travelling merchant families on the Silk Road lived a particularly peripatetic childhood. A Sogdian merchant family, the Sogdians were among the most important commercial intermediaries of the early medieval period, carrying goods between China and the West, might spend years away from their home city, moving along the trade routes with their goods and their family. Children born into such families grew up understanding the road itself as home, the caravanserai where travellers sheltered, the oases where water was available, the particular dangers and pleasures of the route. Across many of the world's major religious traditions, children were enrolled in the service of religious institutions at very young ages. In medieval Christian Europe, the practice of oblation, the offering of a child to a monastery by their family, was common from at least the 6th century and continued in declining form until the 12th century and beyond. A child oblate was given to the monastery typically between the ages of 7 and 12, and from that point lived entirely within the monastery, taking part in the monastic routine of prayer, study, and labour. The children were not given a choice in this. The decision was made by their families, sometimes for religious reasons, to secure divine favour, to dedicate the most promising child to God's service, and sometimes for practical ones. A monastery could educate and feed a child that a poor family could not adequately provide for. The experience of being an oblate varied enormously, depending on the specific monastery and the specific child. Some monastic communities treated their child members with genuine care and affection, providing excellent education and a community of fellow learners. Guibert of Nogent, a 12th century monk who later became an abbot and historian, describes his childhood in a monastery with some warmth, acknowledging the genuine learning he received there, while also noting the loneliness of separation from his family. Other oblates experienced harshness, isolation, and the particular melancholy of a child who's been given away. The debates among medieval theologians about whether it were appropriate to dedicate a child to religious life before they were old enough to make a genuine choice reflect a genuine moral discomfort with the practice that was felt even within the church. Buddhist monasteries across Asia similarly received child monks, boys as young as 5 or 6, shaving their heads and taking on the saffron robe, beginning the long process of learning the Pali Canon or the Mahayana Sutras through recitation. In countries like Tibet, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka, entering a monastery for at least a period of time was, and in some places remains, a normal part of male childhood. A temporary stint of monastic life was considered valuable for its educational and spiritual benefits, even for boys who did not intend to remain monks permanently. The rhythm of monastic life, regular prayer, study, simple meals, communal work, was genuinely demanding but also genuinely structured. Children who thrived in this environment could receive an extraordinarily good education, with access to the extensive libraries that major monasteries maintained, and the instruction of learned monks who had devoted their lives to mastering a body of knowledge. The great monastic schools of medieval Europe, at Canterbury, at St. Gallen in Switzerland, at Monte Cassino in Italy, produced some of the most important scholars of their age. We've spoken of toys and games in passing, but let us linger a little longer in the spaces where children played throughout history, because those spaces tell us something important. The street was, for most of human history, a primary play space for children. In the narrow lanes of medieval cities, in the wide unpaved roads of ancient towns, in the dirt tracks of villages and the paved streets of imperial capitals, children played in the street. Not in a car-free, supervised, carefully curated way. In the actual, dangerous, chaotic, fully inhabited street, alongside adults going about their business. This meant that historical children were accustomed to sharing space with adults in ways that modern children are not. They played underfoot of market stalls, around the edges of workshops where craftsmen worked, alongside the paths where animals were driven and carts were pulled. They developed a street sense, an awareness of when to get out of the way, of which adults were friendly and which were not, of the particular dangers of their specific urban environment. That was a form of practical intelligence quite different from anything schools could provide. The tavern was often a space where children were present in historical communities, not because it was considered appropriate for children to be in places where alcohol was consumed, but because in communities without many public spaces, the tavern was often the de facto community centre, and children accompanied their parents there as a matter of course. Medieval children played outside taverns while their fathers drank inside. They watched the comings and goings of village life from this central vantage point. Market days were great occasions for children. The market, held weekly in most medieval towns and villages, was a carnival of sights, sounds and smells, a concentration of the full variety of what the local economy produced. Merchants with unusual goods from distant places, street performers and musicians earning coins from the crowds, food stalls selling things that ordinary households did not make, honey cakes, pickled herring, special breads, animals for sale, the smells and sounds of livestock mixing with the human crowd. For a child whose daily life was otherwise quite circumscribed, the house, the fields, the church, the market day was something like a festival, a brief window onto a larger world. Children who lived in market towns grew up with a broader sense of the world than children who lived in isolated villages, simply because the market brought the world to them. The river or the mill pond was another crucial play space for historical children. Water was central to medieval community life. It powered mills, supplied drinking and cooking water, supported fishing, and served as a laundry. It was also deeply dangerous for children, and the historical record is full of accidental drownings. Medieval coroners' records from England list drowning as one of the most common causes of accidental death for children, and the typical scenario is achingly specific. A child went to fetch water and fell in. A child was playing by the mill pond and fell in. A child crossed a swollen river on a plank bridge and fell in. The danger did not stop children from going to the water. It never does. The pull of moving water on a child's attention is too powerful, and the watching of parents too imperfect. and the need of children to test their own limits too fundamental. Children in every era have been drawn to water and have sometimes drowned in it, and the surviving ones have come away with a knowledge of water, its currents, its depth, its behaviour in different seasons, that was practically useful in a world where water management was a constant concern. We have talked extensively about the external conditions of historical childhood, the work, the education, the play, the illness, the rituals. But what about the inner life of historical children? What did they think about? What did they fear? What did they hope for? This is the hardest question to answer, because children in the past left almost no direct record of their inner lives. They did not, with rare exceptions, keep diaries. They did not write letters that were preserved. Their voices were not transcribed or recorded in any systematic way. What we have are fragments. A child's drawing scratched on a slate in a medieval monastery, the occasional record of a child's speech or behaviour in court documents or chronicles, the evidence of the toys and objects that children owned and that archaeologists have found, the schoolroom exercises that survive on clay tablets or in manuscript form, the drawings that medieval students made in the margins of books they were supposed to be studying, tiny animals, little faces, sometimes caricatures of their teachers. From these fragments, what do we learn? We learn that historical children were curious. The marginalia of medieval manuscripts and the drawings in the margins are full of the kinds of things curious children draw: monsters, wrestlers, rabbits jousting on horseback, knights with impossible weapons, little scenes of daily life. These are not the drawings of a child who's been completely crushed by the weight of their circumstances. They are the drawings of a child who has a rich, playful, imaginative inner life that is looking for expression wherever it can find a crack. We learn that they were sometimes bored. The clay tablets of Mesopotamian schoolboys contain exercises written with varying degrees of care and attention, some neat and practiced, others hurried and careless in ways that suggest a student whose mind was somewhere else. Some tablets contain doodles pressed into the clay alongside the formal exercises. Boredom, it turns out, is historically universal. We learn that they were sometimes homesick. Letters survive from boys sent away to school or service in which they ask for their mothers, ask for food from home, complain about conditions in ways that are entirely recognizable. A Roman schoolboy, writing to his father in the 1st or 2nd century CE, asks for money for supplies and mentions that his mother is not sending him enough warm clothing. The specific complaint is 2,000 years old. The emotional subtext, "Please pay attention to me, please take care of me, I am far from home and it is cold," is completely contemporary. We learn that they were sometimes afraid. The ghost stories and monster legends that every culture has developed for children were not purely entertainment. They reflected real fears. Fears of the dark, of the unknown, of the things that could happen to a small person in a large and dangerous world. The fear was real. The stories were a way of giving it shape and perhaps making it slightly more manageable. And we learn, above all, that they were resilient. Resilient in the specific, profound, quietly extraordinary way that children are resilient. They bounced back from things that would break an adult. They adapted to circumstances that were objectively terrible. They found joy, genuine, uncomplicated, full joy, in situations that adults would have found only miserable. This resilience is not something to celebrate uncritically. Some of what we call resilience in historical children was actually simply the adaptation of people who had no other options, who could not afford to be broken by their circumstances because there was no one to put them back together. The child who learned to suppress grief and continue working was not healthier than a child who was allowed to grieve. They were just surviving in the only way available to them. But there is also, in the genuine resilience of children, their capacity for play, their readiness for joy, their ease in forgetting, something that is truly remarkable and worth appreciating. Children do not need perfect conditions to be happy. They need enough safety, enough warmth, enough connection, enough time that is their own. And even when they do not have quite enough of those things, they often manage to find joy in the margins, in the small spaces between obligations, in the moments when the world relaxes its grip just slightly and they can breathe. The story of modern childhood, of childhood as we understand it today, with its legal protections, its compulsory education, its extended duration and its relative freedom from adult labour, is a 19th and 20th century story. We've touched on some of it. The Factory Acts, the Foundling Hospital, the spread of compulsory schooling. But the full story is worth a little more time, because it is the story of how the world we live in came to be. The 19th century is the key century for understanding the transformation of childhood in the industrialized world. The Industrial Revolution created new and particularly horrifying forms of child exploitation. Children in coal mines, children in textile mills, children sweeping chimneys. These were not new forms of child labour in kind, but they were new in their scale, their severity, and their visibility. The reform movements that arose in response to industrial child labour were not inventing the idea that children deserved protection. This idea existed in various forms across many cultures and periods. They were applying it, with new urgency and new political tools, to a crisis that was visible and documentable in ways that agricultural child labour was not. The images produced by social reformers, the paintings of children in mines, the testimonies of child workers before parliamentary committees, the photographs that became possible with the invention of photography in 1839 and were immediately deployed by reformers to document conditions that words alone struggled to convey, created a new kind of moral pressure. People who might have accepted as normal the idea that poor children worked in fields had a much harder time accepting images of 6-year-old children working in coal mines 12 hours a day, unable to stand upright in the narrow passages. The response was gradual, uneven, and contested at every step. But it happened. Working hours for children were reduced. Minimum ages for various types of labour were established and raised. Compulsory schooling was introduced in England and Wales in 1880, making school attendance mandatory for children between 5 and 10. The school leaving age was gradually raised through the following decades. These legal changes were accompanied by cultural changes, changes in how childhood was understood and valued. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries produced a new, idealized vision of childhood as a period of innocent communion with nature, pure instinct, and uncorrupted perception. Wordsworth's poetry about childhood, Rousseau's educational philosophy, the growing genre of literature written specifically for children, all of these reflected and reinforced a changing cultural understanding of what childhood was and what it deserved. By the late 19th century, the concept of childhood as a protected period, a period of development that deserved special attention, that was categorically different from adulthood, and that should be shielded from the full force of adult demands, was becoming dominant in the educated and middle classes of Europe and North America. It was a genuinely new idea in historical terms, and it has shaped every aspect of how we think about children and childhood since. While we've been sitting here, together in the quiet of this night, children have been falling asleep all over the world, in cities and villages, in rich houses and poor ones, in places where the circumstances are genuinely comfortable, and in places where they are still genuinely hard, where children still work too young and go without adequate food and lack the medical care they need. The full transformation of childhood, the achievement of the conditions that the reform movements of the 19th century began fighting for, is still unfinished. The children who fall asleep tonight in the hardest circumstances are heirs to the same long history we've been exploring. They carry the same need for safety, warmth, connection, and love that every child in every century has carried. They deserve the same protections that children in the wealthiest countries now take for granted. This is perhaps the most important thing that the history of childhood teaches us, that the progress that has been made, real, genuine, hard-won progress, is not an inevitable force that will continue without effort. It required specific people making specific choices. It required reformers who were willing to be unpopular and persistent. It required the gradual building of a consensus that children's welfare was a public concern, not merely a private matter. And it is still being built. The history of childhood is a history of gradual expansion of the circle of protection, of care, of moral concern. Each generation has, at its best, expanded that circle a little further, included a few more children within its protection, reduced a few more forms of suffering that had previously been considered inevitable or acceptable. This is one of the most genuinely hopeful things that history shows us. The past was harder than the present, and if we do the work, the future can be easier than the past. Let us end our extended journey through the world of historical childhood by returning one final time to the texture of ordinary days. Not the great events of history, not the famous names or the dramatic turning points, just the ordinary, repeating texture of a child's ordinary day in the past. The sound of a mother's voice, early in the morning, calling a child from sleep. The smell of whatever was being cooked over the fire, porridge, bread, something simmered from the day before. The weight of cold air when you stepped outside into the morning, whatever season the morning belonged to. The sound of animals, the particular sounds of whatever animals were part of that child's world, cattle lowing, sheep calling to their lambs, chickens starting up their morning noise, a donkey somewhere making its remarkable sound. The specific geography of the child's world, the particular tree at the edge of the village, the particular bend in the path to the well, the particular sound the wind made through the gap in the house wall where the clay had crumbled. The faces of the people who were always there, parents, siblings, neighbours, the teacher if there was one, the priest if there was a church nearby, the blacksmith, the miller, the various figures who populated the small, intimate, fully known world of a pre-modern childhood. These are the textures that get lost in history. History preserves events, not textures. It preserves the famous and the catastrophic, not the ordinary and the daily. But the ordinary and the daily were what most children experienced most of the time in every century and every culture. And those ordinary daily textures, the sounds and smells and temperatures and faces of a child's intimate world, were the material from which that child built everything. Their sense of who they were, their sense of what the world was like, their understanding of what to expect from people and what to give in return. In this they were exactly like us. In this, across all the distance of time and the strangeness of their circumstances, they were us. We are those children, grown unimaginably old, and they are us, impossibly young. and the thread that connects all of it is the same thread that connects you to whatever you loved and feared and wondered at in your own earliest years. On the shores of a Norwegian fjord, in the years when the great age of Norse exploration was beginning, around the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, a child is growing up in a longhouse that smells of smoke and fish and pine tar and the particular damp cold of Scandinavian autumn. The Viking world is often imagined through the lens of raiding and violence, the longships, the axes, the Valhalla mythology. And these were real features of Norse culture. But the daily world of ordinary Norse childhood was much more domestic than the warrior mythology suggests. Most Norse people were farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople. The dramatic raiding expeditions that have lodged in popular imagination were conducted by a minority, mostly younger sons of Norse families who needed to find their fortune somewhere other than the already divided family farm. The childhood of these future raiders began in exactly the same way as the childhood of everyone else, with animals to tend, fields to work, and a family to help sustain through the long northern winters. A Norse child grew up in a world permeated by the old religion. The Norse mythology of Odin, Thor, Freya, Loki, and the vast cosmological drama of the 9 worlds connected by the world tree Yggdrasil. These were not distant theological abstractions. They were the explanatory framework for the world. The thunder was Thor's hammer, the aurora borealis was the Valkyries riding across the sky. The seasons were the result of divine battles and bargains. A child who grew up hearing these stories had a rich and vivid imaginative world in which the supernatural was close and immediate. Norse children, like children everywhere, played with toys, carved wooden horses and ships. The transportation technologies of the Viking world were common children's toys in Scandinavia. Small wooden practice swords prepared boys for the weapon training that was a normal part of Norse masculine education. Girls learned to spin and weave, skills that were highly valued in Norse culture. The quality of a woman's weaving was considered a reflection of her worth and ability. Norse law, the Thing, the assembly system by which Norse communities governed themselves, was not exclusively adult territory. Children were present at the Thing, hearing the cases and the judgments, absorbing the legal culture that they would eventually participate in as adults. The oral memorization of the laws was a skill valued in Norse culture, and children were part of the transmission chain. Formal fosterage, the practice of sending a child to be raised in another household, was common in Norse society and carried specific social meanings. To be fostered by a powerful chieftain was an honour for both the child and the child's family. The foster relationship created bonds of obligation and loyalty that persisted through adult life. Foster siblings might be as close as blood siblings, or closer. The Norse world ended for a child in several possible ways. Boys who showed martial aptitude might join their first raid expedition in their mid-teens. Boys who were the elder sons of farming families would take over the farm at their father's death. Girls would marry, typically in their mid to late teens, and begin managing their own households. The average Norse woman had considerable authority within her domestic domain, with legal rights to property and divorce that were remarkable for the early medieval period. Across the steppes of Central Asia, in the vast, flat, wind-swept grasslands that stretch from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east, a very different kind of childhood was taking place across many centuries. The nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, the Scythians, the Huns, the Mongols, and dozens of smaller groups, organized their lives around the needs of their herds. Cattle, sheep, goats, and horses were their wealth, their food, their clothing material, and their primary reason for movement. The herds needed grass, and grass was seasonal, so the herds and the people who depended on them moved. Children born into this life were saddle-broken almost before they could walk. The Mongols, who would in the 13th century create the largest contiguous land empire in history, trained their children on horseback from the earliest ages. There are accounts of Mongol children being tied to the saddle before they could sit independently, gradually learning to balance and grip through endless hours of motion. By the age of 5 or 6, a Mongol child was expected to ride confidently. By 10, a boy was expected to hunt from horseback. Horse culture shaped everything. The Mongol bow, which was a short recurved composite bow made from layers of different materials and capable of extraordinary power, was the technological foundation of Mongol military dominance. Learning to shoot this bow from horseback accurately at full gallop was a skill that began in childhood and required years of practice. Boys who would grow up to be the feared warriors of the Mongol horde began their archery training as young children, with small bows calibrated to their strength, shooting at targets from standing still before graduating to mounted shooting. Girls on the steppe were also capable riders and often practiced with bows. The Greek accounts of Scythian peoples described warrior women, Amazons in the Greek imagination, who may have been based on real observations of steppe cultures, where women's riding and fighting abilities were more developed than anything the Greeks expected. Food on the steppe was what the steppe provided: meat from the herds, fermented mare's milk, kumis, blood from living animals in times of necessity, and whatever wild plants and game could be found along the migration routes. Children ate the same food as adults, learned to butcher and process animals from early childhood, and understood the intimate connection between the health of the herd and the survival of the family. The spiritual world of nomadic steppe peoples was shamanistic, a tradition in which specially gifted practitioners could journey into the spirit world through altered states of consciousness to communicate with the forces that governed weather, illness, and fortune. Children in shamanic societies grew up in a world where the spirit world was a real and present dimension of experience. The shaman's drum, the vision journey, the spirit helpers. These were features of a cosmological framework that was as vivid and functional as any other religious system. Across the Atlantic, in the high valleys of central Mexico, another civilization was raising its children in ways that were both recognizable and startling. The Aztec Empire, the Mexica people and their subject states, reached its height in the century before the Spanish conquest of 1519. In the great city of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in a lake where Mexico City now stands, perhaps 200,000 people lived, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Aztec education was remarkable in one particularly striking way. It was mandatory for all children, regardless of class or gender. The Karmakak was the school attached to the temple, where children destined for the priesthood or for administrative roles received a rigorous education in religious knowledge, astronomy, history, and the complex Aztec writing system. The Telpashgali was the neighborhood school where ordinary children received instruction in citizenship, moral behavior, practical skills, and military training. Both boys and girls were expected to attend school. Both received instruction in their respective roles and responsibilities. The Aztec state considered the education of all its children a matter of governmental interest, not because childhood was regarded sentimentally, but because a well-trained citizenry and a well-trained military were essential to the functioning of the empire. The moral instruction given to Aztec children was codified in texts known as Huehuetlatoli, sayings of the elders, which were formal speeches delivered on important occasions, prescribing the appropriate conduct for people of every age and status. the speeches addressed to children are remarkable in their combination of genuine tenderness and firm expectation. A speech to a young daughter says, in part, "You came forth from my body, as jade you came forth, as a quetzal feather you came forth." The metaphors of jade and quetzal feathers, both symbols of the highest value in Aztec culture, speak of real parental love. But the same speech goes on to outline the duties and disciplines expected of the girl in terms that leave no ambiguity about the demands of Aztec womanhood. Aztec childhood was also shaped by the cosmic religious framework of the Aztec world. The sun needed to be sustained by human sacrifice, and while most of those sacrificed were captive warriors taken in the flower wars specifically conducted to provide sacrificial victims, children were occasionally sacrificed as well, particularly in rituals associated with rain and water. The festival of Atlcawalo, devoted to the rain gods, sometimes involved the sacrifice of children. This is among the most disturbing aspects of Aztec childhood to modern eyes, and it is worth noting that children who were selected for sacrifice were treated with great honour, dressed in finery, and offered food and gifts. The Aztec theology framed sacrifice as a gift to the gods, not a punishment. But by any modern standard, it represents a relationship between childhood and death that is almost incomprehensible to us today. The majority of Aztec children, of course, lived full and ordinary lives, doing farm work, learning trades, attending school, playing games. The game of Patoli, a board game played with beans used as dice, was popular throughout Mesoamerica. Children played with clay animal figurines and rubber balls. They told stories. They danced at festivals. They got in trouble and were punished and made up with their parents and went to sleep in their family's home. On the other side of the Andes, in the high-altitude empire of the Inca, children navigated a world that was organized with extraordinary administrative precision. The Inca state divided its subjects into age categories for administrative purposes, and each category had specific obligations and roles. Children, both boys and girls, were considered a resource of the empire as well as of their families. The system of mita, labour taxation, required every subject household to contribute labour to the state in various forms, and children, once they reached a certain age, were included in this system. The Akalakuna, the chosen women, were girls selected from across the empire for their beauty and intelligence, taken to Cusco, the Inca capital, and educated in the arts of weaving, cooking, and religious service. Some became wives of the Inca emperor or high nobles. Some became priestesses of the sun god Inti. Some were sacrificed in the Capac Cocha ritual, which took place during particularly important events and at remote mountain shrines. Like the Aztec child sacrifices, these were framed theologically as the highest honour, and the children selected for Capac Cocha were treated with extraordinary care and reverence in the period before their death. Archaeological excavations of these high-altitude shrines, where the cold and dry conditions have preserved remarkable things, have revealed the children buried there, their bodies intact, their faces serene, surrounded by offerings. They were given coca leaves and chicha, corn beer, in the final days, which would have produced an altered state. They died likely in peace, though of cold. The discovery of these children and the extraordinary preservation of their bodies is one of the most haunting encounters with the ancient world that archaeology has produced. For ordinary Inca children, the vast majority, life was shaped by the agricultural and herding rhythms of the Andean world, modified by the specific demands of the altitude and the particular crops and animals of that environment. Potatoes, quinoa, and corn were staples. Llamas and alpacas were the primary animals, providing wool, meat, and transportation. Children helped with all of these in the ways appropriate to their age and strength. Let us move to Italy. The year is perhaps 1480. The city is Florence. The Renaissance, the great cultural flowering of the 14th through 16th centuries, centred initially in the city-states of northern Italy, transformed childhood in the upper classes in some specific ways. The renewed interest in classical learning that characterized the Renaissance produced a new educational ideal, the uomo universal, the universal man who was accomplished in letters, arts, sciences, and physical skills alike. A wealthy Florentine boy of the late 15th century might receive an education that combined rigorous study of Latin and Greek with training in music, drawing, horsemanship, and swimming. He might study mathematics with a humanist tutor who believed in the classical ideal of the well-rounded person. He might be taken to see the works of Botticelli or Ghirlandaio in the church of Santa Maria Novella, or watch his father's friend Leonardo da Vinci sketching in his notebooks in the piazza. This was genuinely different from medieval educational practice in its emphasis on the individual and on a broader range of human development. The Renaissance humanists argued that childhood was a particularly important period for the formation of character and intellect, and that the right kind of education during these years could produce the ideal adult. This was, in a sense, the beginning of a more modern understanding of childhood as a formative period deserving of specific attention and investment. But this elevated ideal touched only a tiny fraction of children, the sons and occasionally daughters of the very wealthy. For the vast majority of Italian children during the Renaissance, life continued to be shaped by the same agricultural and artisan economies, the same work expectations, and the same early entry into adult labour that had characterised medieval childhood. The foundlings of Florence are a poignant example of the darker underside of Renaissance prosperity. The famous Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi and opened in 1445, was established to care for abandoned children. Unwanted children, the illegitimate children of wealthy fathers who could not acknowledge them, the children of desperately poor mothers who could not feed them, the children of women who had died in childbirth without family to care for them, were left in the foundling wheel, a rotating drum set into the wall of the hospital, which allowed a child to be deposited anonymously without the parent being seen. The Innocenti took in thousands of children. Many of them died in infancy. The mortality rate in such institutions was tragically high, partly due to the challenges of providing adequate nutrition without breastfeeding mothers. Those who survived were housed, educated in basic literacy and practical skills, and apprenticed into trades or domestic service when they reached an appropriate age. The Innocenti was a genuinely compassionate institution for its time. But the lives of foundlings, even in the best circumstances, were lives marked by the particular vulnerability of having no family, no advocate, no one whose specific love and attention was attached to your survival. The orphanage as a formal institution developed across Europe from the medieval period onward, accelerating in the early modern period as urbanization increased the number of children without family support. In England, the Foundling Hospital in London, established by the philanthropist Thomas Coram in 1739, was a landmark institution. Coram had been so distressed by the sight of abandoned children dying in London streets, a common enough sight in the 18th century city, that he spent 17 years campaigning for the establishment of a dedicated institution to care for them. The Foundling Hospital became one of the great charitable enterprises of 18th century England, supported by artists like Hogarth and musicians like Handel, who gave benefit concerts for its support. The children of the Foundling Hospital were given names, sometimes taken from the list of governors, so that benefactors' names were preserved in this particular way, educated and trained for employment, Boys were trained for apprenticeships or sea service. Girls were trained for domestic service. The ambitions of the institution were genuinely benevolent, and for many children it provided a stability and education that would otherwise have been unavailable to them. But institutional childhood is not the same as family childhood, and the children of the Foundling Hospital and of the hundreds of similar institutions across Europe grew up without the particular attachments that define family life. They were cared for, fed, educated, disciplined. They were not individually, specifically, unconditionally loved in the way that children within families were loved. This absence, the absence of a person whose love for you was unconditional and permanent, is a specific kind of deprivation, and it shaped the adults these children became. The use of children in military roles, as soldiers, servants, drummers, and in support roles, is a painful and persistent feature of human history that deserves acknowledgement. In many ancient armies, boys of 12 and 13 served as attendants to soldiers, carrying equipment, tending horses, providing food and water. Some of these boys gradually took on more active military roles. Alexander the Great's army included young men in their mid-teens among its fighting forces. By the standards of their time, they were considered old enough for war. In medieval Europe, squires, boys training for knighthood, might accompany their knight into battle from their mid-teens. The role of squire was explicitly a military apprenticeship, and the battlefield was considered an appropriate classroom for this training. In the Napoleonic Wars, the great military conflicts that swept across Europe from the 1790s to 1815, the armies of France and other nations included drummers and musicians who were often very young. These boys served crucial tactical functions. Military orders in the pre-radio era were communicated by drum signal and bugle call across the noise of battle. There are accounts of French drummer boys as young as 12 who were killed or wounded in battle, and some of them became celebrated as heroes. The drummer boy of Arcola, depicted in a famous painting from the Revolutionary period, a child, clearly very young, playing his drum at the front of an advancing column, represents the intersection of genuine heroism and genuine exploitation that defines the history of child soldiers. These children were courageous. They were also children, put in harm's way by adults. Throughout history and in many parts of the world today, the use of children in military roles has been driven by the same combination of necessity and exploitation that characterized child labor in every other domain. Children were available, they were controllable, and they cost less to maintain than adult fighters. In the organized armies of major states, there were often nominal age requirements that were honored more in the breach than the observance. In irregular forces and civil conflicts, such requirements often did not exist at all. Throughout all of the history we've explored, there has been a constant variable that shaped every aspect of childhood: economic class. The experience of a wealthy child and a poor child in any given time and place was dramatically different. And this difference was not simply a matter of comfort and amenity. It was a difference in the fundamental structure of childhood itself. A wealthy child had time for education, time for play, time for the gradual development of skills and character that we now associate with childhood development. The children of the aristocracy and the wealthy merchant class were not expected to work. They were expected to learn, and this learning, though it was often rigorous and sometimes harsh, was nonetheless a form of protected development unavailable to poor children. A poor child had no time. Every hand was needed. Every hour was accounted for. Play was the margin, not the centre of childhood. Education was a luxury that most poor families simply could not afford, either in money or in the labour foregone when a child was at school instead of working. This economic division had consequences that echoed through adult life and across generations. Literacy and numeracy, concentrated in the upper classes, provided access to economic and political power that reinforced and perpetuated class advantage. The wealthy child who'd been educated was better positioned to navigate the legal and commercial systems of adult life. The poor child who had not been educated was vulnerable in ways that the system offered no remedy for. There were exceptions. There were brilliant children from poor families who caught the attention of a patron and were educated far above their station. There were scholarship foundations, many of them established by the Church, that provided pathways for exceptional children regardless of class. In China, the imperial examination system theoretically allowed a boy of any class to study for and pass the examinations that led to official positions. In practice, the leisure required for the years of study necessary to pass these examinations was itself a form of wealth. But the theoretical openness of the system was real enough that a significant minority of successful candidates came from non-elite backgrounds. These exceptions are worth noting precisely because they were exceptions. The rule, across most of human history, was that your childhood was shaped fundamentally by the circumstances into which you were born, and those circumstances largely determined the adult you would become. History is full of children who became famous adults, and some of their childhoods are worth pausing on because they illuminate the wider patterns we've been exploring. Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, one of the greatest musical geniuses in human history, began playing the harpsichord at 3 and composing at 5. His father, Leopold, was himself a violinist and composer who recognized his son's extraordinary gift and dedicated himself to cultivating it. Young Wolfgang and his sister Nannerl were exhibited across Europe as musical prodigies, playing in the courts of Versailles, London, Vienna, performing for aristocrats and royalty and crowds of curious observers. It was an extraordinary childhood in some respects. Travel, adventure, exposure to the finest music and musicians of Europe. But it was also a childhood entirely subordinated to the demands of genius and of his father's ambition. Wolfgang spent his youth performing, practicing, and pleasing others. His adult life was marked by a difficulty with self-management and money that many biographers have traced at least partly to a childhood in which he had no autonomy and no experience of ordinary life. Mary Queen of Scots was sent to France at the age of 5, betrothed to the French Dauphin and raised in the French royal court. She was a child of remarkable beauty and intelligence who spoke French, Latin, Italian, Spanish and Scots by the time she was a teenager. She was also completely isolated from her own country and her own people, shaped entirely by the French court that surrounded her, and when she returned to Scotland as a young adult, she was in many respects a stranger in her own kingdom. Her childhood of gilded exile contributed to the adult political disasters that eventually led to her captivity and execution. Leonardo da Vinci was the illegitimate son of a Florentine notary, raised partly by his father's family and partly in his earliest years by his mother, a peasant woman named Caterina. His illegitimacy barred him from many of the formal educational pathways available to legitimate sons of his father's class, but it may also have freed him from the expectations and constraints that a more conventional Florentine education would have imposed. His insatiable curiosity, his habit of observing everything with unmediated attention, his willingness to approach problems without the preconceptions that formal training often brings. These qualities may owe something to the unconventional childhood in which he was neither fully included in his father's world, nor entirely excluded from it. Sometimes the most touching encounters with historical childhood are not the famous ones, but the anonymous ones. there is a gravestone in a Roman cemetery on the Appian Way. It marks the grave of a child of 3, and the inscription was written by the child's father, a freedman who had saved enough money to buy a small stone and have words cut into it. The words say, in Latin, "To Licinia Eucharis, most sweet daughter, who lived 2 years and 8 months, she was so good." That is all. She was good. The simplest and most devastating eulogy imaginable. There are Viking runestones raised in memory of children. There are medieval English legal records that note, in the dry language of coroners' inquiries, the deaths of children in accidents, falling into mill ponds, being kicked by horses, tumbling from cartloads of hay. Accidents that are genuinely painful to read about precisely because the details are so specific. A child of 4, playing near a river, fell in and drowned. A child of 7 was sent to fetch water from the well, and the bucket rope broke and the child fell. These are not historical abstractions. They are moments that were real, that were felt, that devastated the families they happened to. And there are the traces of children's hands on the walls of caves in France and Spain. Not the famous painted caves of Lascaux and Altamira, but smaller caves, less studied, where the hands are smaller. Children's hands, pressed in ochre to the rock and blown through to leave a silhouette. Children 40,000 years ago, putting their hands on the wall and saying, "I was here, I existed. Look." That impulse, to leave a mark, to be witnessed, to say I was here, is perhaps the most fundamental human impulse of all, and children, across all of time, have had it. Let us return now to the night, the dark of history's nights, when children were being settled into sleep. Every culture, in every period, developed rituals to ease the transition from wakefulness to sleep, for children and for adults. These rituals are remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other, which suggests that they emerge from something universal in human psychology and biology. The lullaby, a slow, rhythmically regular song sung to an infant or young child, is the most universal of all these rituals. The earliest known lullaby is a Babylonian text dating to around 2000 BCE, found inscribed on a clay tablet. It is addressed to a child who is being noisy and keeping his household gods awake, and it threatens consequences if the child does not stop. The mixture of tenderness and mild menace in this ancient lullaby is recognizable to any modern parent who has stood in a darkened room singing the same 4 lines for the 40th time. In medieval England, lullabies often incorporated religious themes. The mother is singing to the Christ child, so Mary singing to Jesus becomes a frame for every mother singing to her own child, linking the everyday domestic moment to the sacred. Lulle, lulle, little child. The English lullaby tradition stretches back to at least the 13th century in written records, and certainly much further in oral practice. In China, lullabies often invoked the moon, the great pale face of the night, watching over sleeping children. In India, lullabies addressed the child as a precious gem, a jewel in the darkness. In Africa, the rhythms of lullabies often referenced the natural world, the sounds of animals, the movement of water, the breathing of the earth. The light of the night, the fire, the oil lamp, the rushlight, the candle, was a complex presence in historical sleeping arrangements. It provided warmth and enough light to navigate by, but it also posed constant fire risks. Stories of houses burning through the night, of people trapped in homes ignited by coals that had not been properly banked, are common in historical records. Children were taught, from an early age, to be careful around fire. But carelessness happened, and accidents happened, and the fire that warmed and comforted was also the fire that could destroy. The practice of banking the fire, covering the live coals with ash before sleep, so they would survive the night and could be coaxed back to life in the morning, was an evening ritual in every household that depended on fire for warmth and cooking. The word curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire, referring to the bell that rang each evening in medieval towns to signal the time for banking fires and reducing the risk of conflagration in the closely packed buildings. Children who woke in the night in pre-industrial homes woke to darkness that was more absolute than anything most of us experience today. Modern darkness is not actually dark. There is always the glow of screens, of streetlights through curtains, of electronic indicators. Historical darkness was dark, the kind of dark in which you could not see your hand in front of your face, in which the only light was a faint orange glow from the banked coals, or the moon if it was full and the night was clear. Fear of the dark was universal in historical children. The various nocturnal monsters and spirits of folklore, the boogeyman, the various night hags of different traditions, the will-o'-the-wisps and black dogs and banshees of folk belief, were partly attempts to personify and give form to the shapeless fear of darkness itself. If the darkness was full of a specific thing, a specific monster, with a specific character and specific habits, then at least it could be named, and things that can be named can, in a sense, be known. And things that are known are somewhat less frightening than things that are not. The star-filled sky was more visible to historical children than to modern ones, because there was no light pollution. The Milky Way would have been a constant presence on clear nights, a great river of light overhead, the subject of mythology in virtually every culture. Children would have known the stars the way modern children know television characters, as familiar presences with names and stories attached to them. Navigation by stars, planting by stars, timekeeping by stars. These were practical skills that required a familiarity with the night sky that most modern people simply do not have. In the morning the world began again. The cock crowed. The fire was built up. The water was fetched. The bread was made. The work of the day began. And somehow children faced it. They faced it each day, these children of the past, these small people in a hard world, and they found, in the facing of it, something that we can still, faintly, across the great distance of time, recognize as life. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the gradual development of formal schooling for the children of the poor, a development that was, in historical terms, astonishingly rapid and transformative. The Sunday school movement, founded in England by Robert Raikes in the 1780s, began as an attempt to provide the children of the urban poor with at least some basic literacy and moral education. The schools met on Sundays because that was the one day working children were not in the factories or the fields. They were taught to read, initially mainly so that they could read the Bible, and they were given a basic moral education in the framework of Christian virtue. The Sunday schools were enormously successful and spread rapidly. By the early 19th century, they had reached millions of children. They were the first mass educational provision for poor children in England, and they changed the social landscape in ways that are impossible to fully measure, not just in literacy rates, but in the social aspiration and sense of possibility that basic education opened up. The Factory Acts in Britain, beginning in 1833 with the Factory Act that restricted the working hours of children in textile mills and required that mill-owning employers provide some basic education, represent the first legal protections for child workers in British history. They were bitterly contested by manufacturers who argued that they would be economically ruinous. They were inadequately enforced. But they established the principle, the radical, genuinely revolutionary principle, that the state had an obligation to protect children from exploitation in the workplace. This principle, once established, was difficult to reverse. Through the 19th century, the legal protections for children in Britain, and gradually across the developed world, expanded and strengthened. The minimum working age was raised, the maximum hours were reduced. Eventually, compulsory education acts established the requirement that all children attend school, removing them from the workforce for at least part of the day and guaranteeing them access to the literacy and numeracy that had previously been reserved for the privileged. These legal developments represent, in the large sweep of history, a genuinely fundamental shift in how childhood was understood. For the first time in human history, governments explicitly recognized that children's welfare was a matter of public concern, not merely private family management, that children deserved protection from exploitation, that education was not a luxury for the few, but a right for all. This is the world we have inherited. It is so recent by historical standards that it still sometimes feels precarious, and in many parts of the world, the protections for children that we take for granted in wealthy developed nations remain unavailable or inadequately enforced. The history of childhood is not a simple story of progress from darkness to light. It is a complicated, uneven, ongoing story in which genuine advances have coexisted with ongoing failures. But the direction of travel across the last 2 centuries has been toward recognizing something that parents in every era of history have always known intuitively, that children deserve to be protected, cherished, and given the room to grow. The stories that people told their children at night are a window into what they feared, what they hoped for, and what they wanted to transmit to the next generation. The fairy tale tradition, what the Germans call Märchen, what the French called contes de fées, is enormously old. The specific stories that Charles Perrault collected and published in 1697, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, and that the Brothers Grimm collected in the early 19th century were not invented by those collectors. They were very old stories circulating in oral tradition, in some cases with identifiable ancestors in medieval or even ancient sources. Cinderella, for example, the story of the wronged girl who is vindicated by supernatural help and wins the prince, appears in a form recognizably similar to the modern story in a Chinese text from the 9th century. The story of a maltreated child who is redeemed by magical intervention seems to answer something so deep in human psychology that it has been independently generated, or at least recognized and preserved, across dozens of cultures and many centuries. These old stories were more brutal than their modern sanitized versions. The original Sleeping Beauty involved rape. The original Rumpelstiltskin ended with the villain tearing himself in two in a rage. The original Snow White's stepmother was punished by being forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she died. The violence in these stories was not gratuitous. It served a moral function, making the punishment of wrongdoing vivid and memorable. Children in the pre-modern world were familiar with violence as a fact of life, in ways that modern children are not, and the stories they heard reflected that familiarity. But the stories also contained enormous warmth, hope, and the specific comfort of narrative justice, the assurance that the good would eventually be rewarded and the wicked would eventually be punished. For children living in a world that was frequently neither fair nor just, this fictional justice must have been deeply satisfying. The prince always comes in the end. The kindness to the old woman on the road is always repaid. The honest child's virtue is always eventually recognized. These stories were told in the firelight, in the evenings when the day's work was done, when children were allowed to be still and to listen and to imagine. They were one of the great pleasures of historical childhood, freely available to all, requiring nothing but a voice and a story and an audience willing to be carried away. Across all of history, in all the places and periods we have visited tonight, one image recurs with the regularity of a heartbeat: a child asleep, small and vulnerable and complete, surrendered to the darkness, breathing softly in the stillness, curled against the warmth of another body, or wrapped in whatever covering the season and the poverty of the household made available. A hand opened, a face relaxed, the weight of the day lifted completely in the trust of sleep. In ancient Rome, in a narrow apartment above a noisy street, a child sleeps. In a Viking longhouse, a small body curled in sheepskin by the dying fire sleeps. In a peasant's cottage in medieval France, in the straw, children sleep. In a noble house in Tudor England, in a carved wooden bed under a heavy coverlet, a child sleeps. In an Aztec house in Tenochtitlan, in a world that will be transformed beyond recognition within a few decades, a child sleeps. They sleep the same way. Their faces have the same stillness. The breathing is the same rhythm. The trust is the same trust. Sleep was perhaps the great equalizer of the pre-modern world. In sleep, the peasant child and the prince's child look the same. In sleep, the orphan and the beloved were the same. The darkness covered them all equally. And in the morning, they would wake, and the world would be hard again. And they would face it the way children always face things, with curiosity and protest and effort and the unreasonable, beautiful resilience of the young. Not in the dramatic night of history, not the night of battles and plots and terrible events, but the ordinary night, the quiet night, the night that most people most of the time experienced as simply the dark hours between one day and the next. In a village in medieval England, the evening routine has a comfortable predictability that is almost hypnotic in its repetition. The animals are brought in or secured. The evening meal is eaten, a pottage probably, a thick vegetable soup or stew that has been simmering over the fire for most of the day, flavoured with whatever herbs and scraps of fat are available, eaten from a shared pot with rough bread torn from the loaf, water or weak ale to drink. The meal is filling rather than delicious, sustaining rather than pleasurable, though on feast days and in better-off households there is more variety and sometimes real pleasure. After the meal there is a period of domestic work, spinning, mending, small repairs, done by the flickering light of a tallow candle or a rushlight. A rushlight is a simple and cheap light source, a rush stripped of its outer covering, leaving a thin pith, then soaked in fat and set in a simple holder. It burns with a dim amber light that is enough to see by close-up, but casts almost no light across a room. The radius of light in a medieval home at night is very small. Beyond a few feet from the flame, the darkness is deep. The fire is the heart of the room's warmth and light. As the evening progresses, it is allowed to burn lower. The last task before sleep is banking it, covering the coals with ash to hold them safely through the night. This is done carefully, because if the fire dies entirely, restarting it from cold is laborious, striking flint against steel to make a spark, catching the spark on a piece of charcloth, nursing it with tinder until it becomes a flame. A household that allowed its fire to die entirely depended on a neighbour's fire to restart it, and the borrowing of fire between households was a specific social exchange with its own customs and expectations. The children are put to sleep first. This is a constant across almost all historical households. Children to sleep, and then the adults might sit up a little longer, talking quietly, finishing work before they too retired. The children's sleep comes quickly. They are tired in the way that people who have spent their days in physical activity outdoors are tired. A complete, wholesome fatigue that reaches down to the bones. They do not lie awake. They do not scroll through anything. They do not have racing thoughts about tomorrow's obligations. They are simply, completely, entirely tired, and they fall into sleep the way water falls into a pool, completely, without resistance. The sounds of the night settle around them. The fire pops softly. The house settles, the timbers expanding and contracting, making the small creaks and ticks of old wood. Outside, the wind moves through the thatch of the roof. Somewhere a dog barks once and falls silent. The moon, if it is a clear night, sends a cold light through the gap under the door or the small shuttered window. An owl calls from the tree at the edge of the village, the long wavering hoot that has meant night for as long as there have been people to hear it. The parents lie down. The fire is very low now, just a red glow in the banked ash. The darkness is nearly complete. Outside, the village is silent. The fields are silent. The road is silent. The whole world for this hour is still. This is how millions of people spent their nights across thousands of years. Without the noise that fills our modern nights, without the light that seeps into our modern darkness, without the screens that interrupt our modern stillness, in genuine, complete, ancient quiet. And in that quiet, the children of the past slept. They slept through that quiet, and their sleep was complete, and the morning would come, as it always came, with the cock's crow and the fire's need and the water to fetch and the day to begin. As we come toward the end of our journey tonight, let us pause for just a moment at the border between the past and the present. We have travelled through so many centuries, so many cultures, so many childhoods. We have witnessed genuine hardship, infant mortality rates that would be catastrophic by modern standards, child labour that we would now recognise as exploitation, physical punishment that we would now recognise as abuse, educational deprivation that we would now recognise as injustice. We have seen children who worked before they could read, who were apprenticed before they were teenagers, who were married before they were women, who were sacrificed before they were even fully grown. And we have seen something else. We have seen children who played with spinning tops and knuckle bones and toy horses. Children who ran in the evening light after a day of work and were, for those few minutes, simply running. Children who were sung to sleep and told stories and held close and wept over when they were lost. Children who were loved in exactly the way that children are always loved, with a love that is not diminished by poverty or time or the brutal constraints of a harder world. The comparison to modern childhood is not a simple one, and it is not a comfortable one. Modern children in wealthy countries are, by almost any material measure, vastly better off than their historical counterparts. They are fed more reliably. They are vaccinated against diseases that killed tens of thousands of historical children every year. They have access to medical care that would have seemed miraculous, genuinely miraculous, to a medieval parent watching a child die of a fever that a course of antibiotics would have cleared in a week. They are legally protected from exploitation in the workplace. They are required to receive a formal education. They have more toys, more space, more time for play and exploration and development than most children in human history ever had. These are real and enormous gains. They are not to be dismissed or minimized. They represent the accumulated effort of generations of reformers, physicians, educators, and ordinary parents who fought to give children better lives than they themselves had experienced. And yet, modern childhood has its own particular shadows. The disconnection from nature, from physical work, from the community of mixed-age people, that characterized pre-modern childhood has its own costs. Children who spend their days indoors, who have few responsibilities, who are shielded from all consequence and difficulty. These children sometimes grow into adults who find the ordinary demands of adult life overwhelming because they have had no practice in meeting difficulty. The anxiety epidemic among modern children and adolescents in wealthy countries is real, and its causes are multiple and complex. But among them is surely the tension between the evolutionary heritage of childhood, which was shaped by physical challenge, social belonging, and gradual increasing responsibility, and the modern construction of childhood as a protected bubble of education and consumption from which all genuine difficulty has been removed. This is not a reason to be nostalgic for the hardships of the past. It is simply an invitation to hold both things at once, to appreciate the genuine gifts of modern childhood, while also remaining curious about what has been lost in the making of it. The children of the past had a harder life. They also had a clearer sense of their own usefulness, their own place in the community, their own capacity to endure and contribute and matter. These things have value, even if the circumstances that produced them were brutal. We do not want to return to infant mortality rates and child labour and the birch rod in school. But we might, with the past as our companion, think carefully about what else was present in those harder childhoods, what kinds of experience, what forms of belonging, what relationship with difficulty, that we could offer our children in gentler forms within the safety of the world we have built, and so we come gently to rest. The journey has been long, from the first cry of a newborn in a Roman insula, to the quiet of a Viking longhouse in winter, to the high-altitude silence of an Inca mountain shrine, to the schoolrooms and foundling hospitals of the industrial age. We have travelled far, and we have seen much. Let me hold all of it gently for you, the way you might hold a handful of old things, a worn wooden toy, a small clay figurine, a fragment of a lullaby, and feel the weight of all the children who held them before you. Those children are long gone. Their names in most cases are unknown. The specific texture of their individual lives is lost. We can reconstruct the outlines, but the particular, personal, irreplaceable experience of being a specific child, in a specific household in a specific moment of history, that is gone, dissolved back into the past from which it came. But something remains. Something persists across all the centuries and all the cultures we have visited tonight. It is the most fundamental thing about childhood, the thing that makes it recognizable across the most extreme differences of time and place and circumstance. Children want to be safe. They want to be warm. They want to be held. They want to be sung to. They want to play. They want to know that someone somewhere loves them enough to stay close through the dark. These wants are not cultural. They're not historical. They're biological, evolutionary, deeply wired into the human animal. And they have been present in every child who has ever lived, from the earliest humans to the children who are falling asleep right now, tonight, in beds around the world. The world they wake to will be different from the worlds we have visited. It will be different from your world too. Even modern childhood changes generation by generation in ways that are difficult to track from inside them. But the child who wakes in it will be the same in the most essential ways as every child who has ever woken. Hungry, curious, full of life, ready to begin. There is something deeply comforting in this. The harshness of the past, real as it was, undeniable as it is, did not break the fundamental human thing. Children went through it and came out the other side, and grew up, and had children of their own, and those children did the same, in an unbroken chain that connects the infant in the ancient Egyptian grave to you, tonight, listening to this. You are part of that chain. Your life, however it began, however it proceeded, is one of the links. The lullabies that were sung to you were sung to someone else before you, and to someone before them, going back and back through the centuries in an unbroken line of breath and melody. The stories that were told to you, your particular family's stories, your culture's stories, the stories of history that you have gathered through your years, these too are links in the chain of human meaning-making reaching all the way back to the firelight and the cave wall and the very first people who told each other stories to make the dark less frightening. Tonight, the dark is not frightening. Tonight, you are the child, and the long history of the past is the lullaby being sung to you. All those millions of children, all those millions of nights, all that accumulated weight of human experience, it becomes, tonight, simply the slow sound of breathing in a quiet room. You have heard about the past. You have travelled through it gently. You have borne witness to lives very different from yours, and perhaps found in them something that feels, quietly, familiar. Let all of that settle now. Let the centuries fold together, like layers of warm blankets pulled up around you, each one adding just a little more weight, a little more warmth, a little more stillness. The Roman child is asleep. The Viking boy is asleep. The medieval girl in her cold room is asleep, her breath making small clouds of warmth in the winter air. The Aztec child, the Inca child, the Chinese child, the Indian child, the African child. Across all the centuries and all the cultures, they are asleep, and their sleep is the same sleep, and the night holds them all equally, and it holds you too. Whatever this day held, whatever worries, whatever tasks undone, whatever thoughts that have not yet found their resting place, let the night take them now, the way it took the thoughts of every child and every adult across all of human history, drawing them down into the dark, into the quiet, into the warm forgetting of sleep. You are safe. You are warm. You are held. The past is not frightening. It is simply old and tired and resting, the way all things rest eventually in the quiet dark. Your breathing is slowing even now. Your body is heavier against what holds you. The sounds of the world are moving further away, as they always do at this hour, when sleep begins to come in from the edges and fill the room. Let it come. There is nothing left to do tonight. Nothing left to solve or worry or prepare. Just this slow, quiet, ancient act of closing your eyes and surrendering to the night. The children of the past did it every night. They did it in cold rooms and warm ones, in poverty and in plenty, in times of peace and times of great trouble. They lay down and closed their eyes and let the darkness take them, trusting that the morning would be there when they returned to it, and it always was. The morning is always there, but for now, for this good, quiet, long-awaited now, there is only the night. Sleep well. You have earned it. Sleep gently, the way the past sleeps, deeply, peacefully, without urgency, held in the dark by the long, slow breathing of all the time that has ever passed. And if you have found comfort here tonight, in these stories, in this journey through the long ago, then perhaps you will visit again. There are so many more stories waiting, so many more nights in history that hold their quiet wonders and their gentle truths, so many more journeys we could take together into the past, while the present holds still and the night does its patient ancient work. Until then, rest now. The fire is banked. The house is still. The stars are doing what stars have always done, turning slowly in the black sky above, watching over a world full of sleeping children. And you are one of them tonight. You always were. Good night.